I bought the cabin 3 years ago. It was a small, old thing, sitting deep in the woods about 20 miles outside of town. I wasn't the kind of person who enjoyed living around too many people. Something about crowds always made me uneasy. I liked silence. I liked being alone. The cabin had been cheap, mostly because no one wanted it. The real estate agent warned me that it needed work. Rotting wood on the porch, a rusted-out water heater, and the insulation was barely enough to keep the place warm during winter. But none of that bothered me. I was good with my hands. I figured a few months of fixing it up, and I'd have the perfect little place to live in peace. The first year was fine. Hard work, long days spent chopping wood, sealing leaks, replacing old boards. I learned to live with the sound of the trees creaking in the wind, the distant howls of coyotes at night. But then, one morning in late fall, everything changed. I woke up to a smell. It wasn't strong at first, just a faint, musty odor, like something damp had been left out too long. I figured it was the woodpile. Maybe some of it had gotten wet in the rain. I ignored it, got dressed, and went about my morning routine, boiling water for coffee, stepping outside to check the traps I'd set overnight. By midday, the smell had gotten worse. It wasn't just musty anymore. It was sharp, sour, clinging to the back of my throat even when I breathed through my mouth. I checked the kitchen first. Maybe some food had gone bad. Nothing. The fridge was running fine. Then I checked under the sink, thinking maybe a rodent had crawled in and died. Nothing there either. By evening, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The whole cabin stank like rotting meat. It was strongest near the back of the cabin, by the door that led to the small storage room. I hesitated before opening it. Something about the way the smell hung in the air made my skin crawl. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The room was dark. The single window was covered in dust, barely letting in any light. I reached in, fumbling for the pull string that turned on the bare bulb overhead. The light flickered weakly. Then I saw it. A body, sprawled on the floor, face down. For a second, my brain refused to understand what I was looking at. The skin was gray, stretched tight over the bones. The clothes were damp, clinging to the shape beneath. I could see where the flesh had started to break down, dark patches spreading across the back. I stumbled back, my stomach twisting. The smell was unbearable now. My first thought was, how did it get here? I lived alone. No one ever came out this way. There were no roads leading up to the cabin, just a dirt trail that I rarely used. Even hunters didn't bother coming this deep into the woods. And yet, here was a dead man in my storage room. I forced myself to step closer. My hands were shaking. I didn't want to touch him, but I had to see his face. I grabbed his shoulder and turned him over. His eyes were open, mouth slightly parted, like he'd died mid-breath. His skin was dark with bruises, lips cracked, fingernails blackened. But the worst part was his throat. A deep, jagged wound ran across it, dried blood caking his collar. Someone had killed him and left him here. I stepped back, feeling like the walls were closing in around me. I needed to think. The cabin had been locked. No windows were broken. That meant whoever put him here had a key, or they'd come in when I was gone and locked up behind them. That thought sent a cold rush through me. Had they been inside while I slept? I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. I had to get the police. But my phone was useless out here, no signal, no Wi-Fi. The nearest place with a landline was a gas station, about 10 miles away. I grabbed my coat, my boots, and my rifle, just in case. I stepped outside and locked the door behind me. The sun was already starting to set, casting long shadows across the trees. I walked fast. The gas station wasn't much. A single pump, a small convenience store, the kind of place where people stopped for a soda or a pack of cigarettes on their way to somewhere else. The cashier looked up when I came in. He was an older guy, probably in his 60s, with a lined face and a cigarette hanging from his lips. I asked to use the phone. He didn't ask questions. The police arrived an hour later. 2 deputies, one older, one younger. They listened as I told them what I found. The older one, a guy named Daniels, nodded slowly, taking notes. The younger one, Mercer, didn't say much, just kept glancing at the rifle slung over my shoulder. They followed me back to the cabin. By the time we got there, it was dark. I unlocked the door and stepped inside first, my pulse pounding. The smell hit me again, even stronger now. But when I led them to the storage room, I stopped cold. The body was gone. The room was empty. No blood. No sign that anyone had ever been there. I turned to Daniels, my mouth dry. I swear, he was right here. Daniels frowned, then turned to Mercer. Check outside. Mercer nodded and stepped out. I stood there, staring at the empty floor, trying to make sense of it. The smell was still there, lingering in the air, but the body was gone. Daniels sighed. Sir, are you sure about what you saw? I didn't answer, because I didn't know anymore. Mercer came back a few minutes later. Nothing outside. No tracks, no blood, no signs of anything. Daniels gave me a long look. You been drinking? Clenched my jaw. No, he sighed again, rubbing his temple. Well, look, if you see anything else, let us know. And just like that, they left. I stood there in my cabin, alone, staring at the empty room where a dead man had been just hours before. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, rifle in my lap, listening, waiting. By morning, the smell was gone. I checked the whole cabin, every inch of it. No signs of forced entry, no blood, nothing. I didn't know what scared me more. The fact that someone had been in my cabin and left a body, or the fact that they'd come back to take it before the cops arrived. I didn't stay long after that. A week later, I packed up what little I owned, locked the place up, and left. I never went back. I was a furniture mechanic, fixing and restoring old wooden pieces. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but I liked working with my hands, and I was good at it. Most of my work was done in town, but every now and then, I got called out to remote places. People with money who had antique furniture they didn't trust anyone else to fix. That's how I ended up at a cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. The man who hired me, a guy named Richard, had bought the place recently. He told me he wanted to fix it up and turn it into a hunting retreat. He had old wooden furniture in there, some of it original to the cabin, and he wanted it restored instead of replaced. He paid me in advance, which was rare, and told me I could stay in the cabin while I worked since it was too far to drive back and forth every day. The place was deep in the woods, off an old logging road that barely showed up on maps. It was fall and the leaves had turned, making the drive in almost pleasant. The cabin itself was bigger than I expected. 2 floors, a porch that wrapped around the front, and thick log walls that had been there for decades. The air smelled like damp wood and fallen leaves. The trees around the cabin were dense, blocking most of the sky. It felt isolated. Inside, the furniture was old but solid. Massive wooden chairs, a dining table that could seat 10, a wardrobe, a heavy desk in one of the upstairs rooms. Most of it was covered in dust. Some pieces had scratches, others had rotting legs that needed replacing. I had brought my tools and supplies, figuring it would take me a week, maybe more, to get everything done. I started with the dining table. The wood was dry and cracked, and one of the legs was loose. I set up my tools in the main room, laid out everything I needed, and got to work. The only sounds were my tools and the occasional rustle of trees outside. No traffic, no voices, just the quiet of the woods. That first night, I slept in one of the upstairs bedrooms. The cabin had no electricity, just an old wood stove for heat and a few oil lamps for light. I kept one burning next to the bed, not comfortable with the complete darkness. The wind picked up overnight, and I heard branches creaking and shifting outside. At one point, I thought I heard something moving near the porch, but when I looked out the window, there was nothing there. The next day, I moved on to the chairs. They were hand-carved, thick and sturdy, but one of them had a missing piece in the backrest. I set it aside to work on later. I had sanded down two of the others when I heard something outside, heavy footsteps on the porch. I turned quickly, expecting to see Richard or maybe some hunter passing through, but the porch was empty. The woods beyond the clearing were still. I walked to the door, stepped outside, and looked around. Nothing, just the trees and the wind. I shook it off and went back inside. That night, I woke up to the sound of something shifting downstairs, a soft scraping noise like wood against wood. I sat up, listening. The cabin settled and creaked, but this was different. It was deliberate. I got out of bed and grabbed the oil lamp. I moved slowly down the stairs, my bare feet silent on the wooden steps. The main room looked the same as before. My tools on the floor, the furniture where I had left it. But one of the chairs I had been working on was turned slightly, facing away from the table. I stared at it, trying to remember if I had left it like that. I must have. I was just tired, that was all. I put the chair back, made sure the doors were locked, and went back to bed. The next morning, I found deep scratches on the floor near the chair. Not normal scratches from moving furniture, these were long, almost deliberate. I ran my fingers over them, feeling how rough they were. They hadn't been there before. I checked the doors again, still locked. That day, I worked upstairs on the wardrobe. The wood was warped, making the doors stick. I took them off the hinges, sanded the edges, and planned to reattach them the next morning. When I went downstairs for a break, I noticed something strange. The dining table had shifted slightly. It wasn't where I left it. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to convince myself I had just nudged it earlier without realizing it. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside made me sit up. Every shift of the wind made me listen harder. Around midnight, I heard movement again. Not the house settling, something heavier. I gripped the lamp and went downstairs. The furniture was different, not just moved, rearranged. The chairs were no longer around the table. Two were near the door, one was against the wall. The table itself had shifted at least a foot. My tools had been scattered. My toolbox was open. Some of my chisels and sandpaper spilled onto the floor. I checked the door. Still locked. Something was in the cabin. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake, listening. The wind howled outside, and once, just before dawn, I swore I heard a low, slow creaking, like wood bending under weight. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up my tools, left some of the bigger pieces unfinished, and loaded up my truck. Before I left, I went back inside one last time. The main room was still in disarray. The scratches on the floor looked deeper. One of the chairs had been pushed so far back it was almost against the staircase. I walked to the chair, gripping the backrest. It was solid, heavier than I remembered. And then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Carved into the back of the chair, faint and worn with age, were words. Just a few, barely visible unless you looked closely. Leave it. I didn't touch anything else. I walked out, locked the door behind me, and drove away without looking back. Richard called me a few days later, asking why I left early. I told him I had finished most of the work and that the rest was minor. I didn't tell him about the scratches. I didn't tell him about the furniture moving. I didn't tell him about the words on the chair. I never went back to that cabin. Whatever was there, whatever was shifting things in the night, it didn't want me fixing anything. and I wasn't about to argue with it. It was late October when I found myself driving through the back roads of Tennessee, the kind of roads that never seemed to be used by anyone but the people who lived along them. The trees lining the narrow path had already begun shedding their leaves, turning the ground into a thick carpet of gold and brown. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of decaying foliage, and the sky had settled into that dull gray shade that seemed to suck the light out of everything. I hadn't meant to come this way. I told myself that over and over as the road twisted through the hills, the woods creeping closer on both sides. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, and instead of cutting across state lines on the highway, I was stuck in the winding paths of my past. My gas gauge was low, and my phone had no signal. I should have turned around the moment I saw the familiar stretch of road. But I didn't. The further I went, the deeper the feeling settled in my chest. I knew what was coming, knew that just a few miles ahead, tucked between the trees, was a place I hadn't seen in years. A place I swore I'd never go near again. My ex-wife's cabin. It wasn't hers anymore. She had sold it after the divorce, and from what I heard, it sat empty for years before someone else bought the land. That was a long time ago. Whoever owned it now likely didn't even know who we were, didn't know the weight that place held. Still, my fingers clenched tighter around the steering wheel as I rounded the bend. The trees thinned out just enough for the outline of the cabin to come into view. It looked the same. A long gravel driveway led up to the front porch, weeds creeping through the cracks. The dark wood siding was aged and weathered, but the place still stood, the same as it had the last time I saw it. I slowed down, not stopping, but just enough to take it in. And that's when I saw it. A single light in the window. There shouldn't have been a light. The place was supposed to be abandoned. No cars in the driveway, no signs of movement. But there it was, a faint yellow glow behind the curtain of what used to be our bedroom. I kept driving. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe someone had moved in recently and just didn't have a car. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, refusing to let myself look back in the rearview mirror. The feeling didn't go away. The road stretched on for another mile before I spotted a rundown gas station up ahead, the kind that looked like it hadn't changed since the 80s. A single pump stood beside the small building, and the neon open sign flickered weakly in the window. I pulled in, parking beside the pump, and stepped out into the cool evening air. Inside, the store was empty except for an older man behind the counter, flipping through a newspaper. The overhead lights buzzed softly, and the place smelled like stale coffee and motor oil. I grabbed a bottle of water and walked up to the counter. As the cashier rang me up, I hesitated, then asked, "Hey, do you know if anyone lives in that old cabin up the road?" He barely looked up. "Which one?" "The one about a mile back. Used to belong to..." I stopped myself. "Used to be empty for a long time." The man finally glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Ain't nobody lived there in years." I frowned, but I just passed it, saw a light on inside. He stared at me for a long moment, then shrugged. "Couldn't tell you. Place has been sitting quiet for a while now. If there's a light on, maybe someone's squatting in there." That was the most logical explanation. I nodded, paid for the water, and headed back to my truck. But the thought stuck with me. I shouldn't have gone back. I should have just driven off, taken the highway, and forgotten about it. But as I sat there in the parking lot, the sky darkening around me, something in the back of my mind wouldn't let it go. Who would squat in that cabin? It was miles away from anything. There were easier places to hide if someone wanted to get off the grid. And why was the light on in that particular room? I turned the key in the ignition, and then, against every bit of common sense I had, I turned the truck around and headed back. The road was even darker now, the trees pressing in from both sides. My headlights cast long shadows across the dirt and gravel, and the night air seemed thicker than before. When I reached the driveway, I hesitated. The light was still on. I pulled off onto the side of the road, cutting my engine. Sitting there in the dark, I could hear nothing but the wind rustling through the trees. The cabin remained still, no movement behind the windows, no sign of life beyond that single, glowing light. I stepped out of the truck. The air was colder than before. I walked slowly, my boots crunching against the gravel as I approached the porch. The front door was closed, the wood warped and cracked with age. I reached out and tried the handle. Locked. I circled the cabin, my pulse steady but heavy. The windows were filthy, streaked with years of dirt and neglect. I reached the back, where the bedroom window sat just a few feet off the ground. The light was still on, and then I saw something that made my breath catch. The curtain moved, just slightly, just enough for me to see a hand pressing against the glass. Fingers splayed out, motionless. I stepped back. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get back in my truck and leave. But I stood frozen, staring up at that hand, at the pale skin against the dark glass. And then it pulled away. The light went out. Darkness swallowed the cabin. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, my boots slamming against the ground as I bolted back to my truck. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. Gravel flew as I spun the wheel, my headlights slicing through the night. As I sped down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The light was back on, and the curtain was pulled aside. A face stared back at me. I never went back. I don't know who or what I saw that night. Maybe it was a squatter. Maybe it was something else. But I know one thing. I never should have stopped. I never wanted the cabin. It was left to me after my uncle passed, a man I barely knew. He had no children of his own, and for reasons I never understood, he left it in my name. The lawyer who handled his will sent me a letter explaining the details, and a week later, I had the deed in my hands. The cabin was in a small, forgotten town, tucked in a valley far from the main road. The only thing nearby was a graveyard, an old one, the kind with faded tombstones, sunken into the earth, the names barely readable. I had no reason to keep the cabin. I lived in the city, had a steady job, and wasn't interested in some rundown place in the middle of nowhere. I figured I'd go there, check it out, and put it up for sale. Quick trip, maybe a weekend at most. I drove out on a Friday morning. The road stretched long and empty, the trees leaning in like they were trying to swallow the pavement. It rained most of the way, a slow, steady drizzle that made everything gray. By the time I reached the turnoff, the dirt road leading to the cabin was muddy and uneven, my tires slipping as I drove through deep puddles. The first thing I saw was the graveyard. It was about 100 yards from the cabin, surrounded by a rusted iron fence. Some of the metal bars had fallen, the gate barely hanging on by one hinge. The place looked forgotten, like no one had visited in years. The cabin was just as bad. The wood was weathered, the roof sagging a little in the middle. The windows were dirty, streaked with years of grime. I stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking under my weight. The key barely fit in the lock, and when I turned it, the door groaned open, the hinges stiff with rust. Inside, the air was stale. Dust covered everything, tables, chairs, even the floor. The furniture was old, the kind of heavy wooden pieces no one made anymore. A single bookshelf stood against one wall, filled with books so aged their spines had curled. There were no pictures, no personal belongings. It felt more like an abandoned hunting lodge than a home. I spent the first hour just walking around, getting a feel for the place. The cabin had one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living room with a stone fireplace. The bathroom was the only part that had been updated at some point, the sink and toilet newer than everything else. There was a back door leading out to a small clearing, and beyond that, the thick tree line. The forest pressed in from all sides, dense and dark even in the daylight. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, just silence. I told myself it was fine. I'd clean up, take a few pictures, and find a buyer. Maybe some retired couple looking for a quiet place, or some hunter wanting a lodge near the woods. By evening, I had swept most of the dust away and cleaned the kitchen enough to make a simple meal. I sat by the fireplace, listening to the crackling wood, trying to ignore the feeling that the place didn't want me there. Then I heard it, a soft thump outside. I froze. It wasn't an animal. It was too heavy for that. It sounded like a footstep. I turned off the lantern and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The graveyard was just visible in the moonlight, the tombstones casting long shadows. The fence stood silent, unmoving, but something felt off. I waited, holding my breath. After a few minutes, there was nothing, just my own heartbeat in my ears. I told myself it was nothing. The woods played tricks on people. Sounds carried in strange ways out here. I went to bed, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I walked to the graveyard. I didn't know why. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that it was just a normal, empty place. The ground was uneven, covered in weeds. Some of the graves had caved in slightly. The wood of the coffins beneath likely rotted away long ago. I walked between the stones, reading names that meant nothing to me. Most of them were from the 1800s, a few from the early 1900s. There was no sign of anyone else having been there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I went back to the cabin, forcing myself to focus on packing up. I found some old letters in a drawer, written in handwriting so faded I could barely read it. Most of it didn't make sense, but one line stood out. Asterisk, the ground will not keep them. Asterisk, that night, I heard the footsteps again. They were closer. I sat up in bed, gripping the flashlight in my hand, listening. Something moved outside. Slow, deliberate steps. They circled the cabin. Then came the sound of something scraping against the wooden walls. I wanted to believe it was the wind, but I knew better. I didn't sleep. By the third day, I was done. I packed my bags, threw everything into the truck, and was ready to leave. But the truck wouldn't start. The engine wouldn't even turn over. The battery was fine. I checked twice. I sat there, gripping the wheel, forcing myself to stay calm. I had enough supplies to last the night. In the morning, I'd walk to the main road and flag someone down. As the sun set, I locked every door and window, pushing a chair against the front door. The sounds started early this time. First, the footsteps, slow, careful. Then the scratching. Then the breathing, right outside the window. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. The footsteps circled the cabin over and over. Then they stopped. For hours, nothing. Then, a soft creak from inside the cabin. I gripped the flashlight. My hands were shaking. Something was inside. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then another creak. Closer this time. I turned the flashlight on. The room was empty. I grabbed my knife, my hands slick with sweat. I stood in the middle of the cabin, my back to the wall, waiting. Another creak. Right behind me. I spun, but there was nothing. The door was still locked. The windows shut. But something had been there. I stayed awake until dawn. As soon as the sun rose, I grabbed my bags and left on foot, walking until I reached the main road. I never went back. A month later, I sold the cabin for almost nothing. I didn't care. I didn't want it. I never spoke about what happened, never tried to explain. because I didn't understand it myself. But I know one thing, the ground there does not keep the dead. The rain had started falling in the late afternoon, thick and heavy, the kind that didn't come in drops but in solid sheets that swallowed everything in sight. By the time the sun had dipped below the horizon, the Amazon was drenched in darkness, the air thick with the smell of damp earth, rotting leaves, and the sharp, green scent of crushed vegetation. My cabin sat in a small clearing, barely visible through the dense jungle. The roof was metal, dented from years of weathering storms, and the wooden walls had darkened with moisture over time. I had come out here alone, looking for solitude, away from the noise of the city. A friend had mentioned an old research station abandoned deep in the jungle, left behind by a group of biologists years ago. It wasn't much. A single-room structure with a cot, a table, and a few shelves lined with rusting cans of food. The windows had no glass, only wooden shutters, and the door barely held in place with a rusty latch. I had brought supplies, expecting to stay for a couple of weeks, testing my endurance against the jungle, seeing how well I could live with just the basics. The storm grew worse as the night deepened. The sound of rain against the metal roof was deafening, a constant hammering that made it impossible to hear anything beyond the walls of the cabin. The jungle was alive with movement, the sound of leaves shifting, branches cracking under the weight of unseen things. I sat at the small wooden table, the glow of my flashlight barely cutting through the gloom. I had eaten earlier, canned beans and some stale crackers, washed down with warm water from my supply. The humidity made everything feel sticky, my shirt clinging to my back, my skin damp no matter how many times I wiped it dry. I had left my boots by the door, caked in mud from the hike earlier. The inside of the cabin smelled of damp wood, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of the machete resting on the table beside me. Then something shifted outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, the way it moved through the trees, making the leaves rustle in a rhythmic pattern. But this was different, a deliberate sound, slow footsteps in the mud, just outside the cabin. The rain should have drowned out everything, but I heard it clear as day, squelch, pause, squelch. Someone or something was moving just beyond the walls. I turned off my flashlight, plunging the cabin into darkness. My eyes adjusted, the only light coming from the occasional flicker of lightning through the gaps in the wooden shutters. I held my breath, listening, straining to hear past the rain. The footsteps stopped. Silence except for the relentless downpour. I waited, seconds stretching into minutes. My hand gripped the handle of my machete, my knuckles white. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a tapir wandering too close, or a jaguar moving through the underbrush. But something didn't feel right. The footsteps had been too precise, too human. Then came the knock. Not loud, not demanding. Just a single, deliberate knock on the wooden door. I stayed frozen. The rain pounded against the roof, water dripped from the corners of the cabin, and my own heartbeat thundered in my ears. Another knock. Soft, slow. I didn't move. Whoever was out there knew I was inside. The cabin was small, isolated. There was no way to hide, no way to slip out unseen. I waited, gripping the machete, willing myself to breathe quietly. Minutes passed. No more knocks, no more footsteps, just the storm relentless as ever. I didn't sleep that night, sitting in the chair, staring at the door, waiting for something else to happen. Morning came slowly, the rain finally easing into a misty drizzle. I forced myself to move, my muscles stiff from staying in the same position for hours. I unlatched the door cautiously, pushing it open just enough to see outside. Mud. The ground was thick with it, pooling in places where the rain had carved deep grooves. And there, just a few feet from the door, were footprints. Not animal tracks, bare human feet, deep impressions in the wet earth. I stepped outside, scanning the tree line, my machete still clutched in my hand. Nothing. No sign of who or what had been there during the night. The tracks led away from the cabin, disappearing into the jungle. I followed them for a few steps, but they were washed out by the rain, blending into the endless brown of the forest floor. I went back inside, shutting the door behind me, securing the latch as best as I could. I wasn't alone out here. Someone was watching, waiting. I packed my things. The plan had been to stay for 2 weeks, but I had no reason to test my luck. By noon, I was hiking back through the jungle, my gear strapped to my back, my machete never leaving my hand. The path was muddy, the air thick with moisture, but I moved fast, my pulse quick with the knowledge that I wasn't safe. I didn't look back. I had never planned to be alone in that cabin. It was meant to be a quiet trip, one where I could get away from the noise of daily life, clear my head, and just exist in peace. My friend Mark had been the one to suggest it. He had stayed there once before, a few years back, and told me it was the perfect place to just relax. I didn't ask many questions at the time. I trusted his word, and when he said it was remote but comfortable, I figured it was exactly what I needed. The cabin was deep in the English countryside, somewhere in the Midlands, surrounded by thick woods. It wasn't too far from the nearest town, maybe a half-hour drive, but it was isolated enough that I wouldn't see another soul for the duration of my stay. That was the appeal. I had spent too much time caught up in the rush of the city, and I wanted to get away from it all. It was early October when I arrived, and the air had already started to turn crisp. The drive out had been uneventful, though the last stretch of road leading to the cabin had been rough. The path was narrow, little more than a dirt track that wound through the trees, and by the time I pulled up outside the cabin, my car was coated in a fine layer of dust. The cabin itself was modest but well kept. A single-story wooden structure with a slanted roof, a small porch, and a stone chimney. There was a shed off to the side, which Mark had told me was used for firewood, and behind the cabin, the trees stretched endlessly into the distance. It was peaceful. I spent the first few hours settling in. The inside was simple, just a living area, a kitchenette, a bedroom, and a small bathroom. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, nothing but the bare essentials. That was fine. I had brought books, and I planned to spend most of my time just reading and hiking. By the time the sun started setting, I was outside chopping some wood for the fireplace. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath in the air as I worked. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just enjoying the rhythm of splitting logs and stacking them beside the porch, when I noticed something strange. The woods had gone completely silent. At first, I didn't register it as anything unusual, but as I stood there, axe in hand, I realized that the usual background noise, the rustling of leaves, the occasional bird call, had vanished. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. I turned slowly, scanning the treeline. There was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there. I gave one last glance before picking up the chopped logs and heading inside. Maybe I was just being paranoid. It had been a long day and I was tired. That was all. Inside, I got a fire going, cooked a simple meal, and settled into one of the old armchairs with a book. I kept telling myself that I was overthinking it, that I wasn't used to the isolation, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard something outside, a soft crunch of leaves. It was faint, barely noticeable over the crackling of the fire, but it was there. I set my book down and listened. Another crunch, footsteps. My heart started to hammer in my chest. I stood up slowly, moving toward the window. The porch light barely reached past the clearing, but I could just make out the edge of the woods. Then I saw her, a woman, standing just beyond the tree line. She wasn't moving, just standing there staring. Even from a distance, something about her was wrong. Her clothes looked tattered, like they had been worn for far too long. Her hair was a tangled mess, hanging in long, uneven strands around her face. But it was the way she stood that made my skin crawl. Completely still, arms limp at her sides, head tilted slightly as if she was trying to listen to something. I didn't move. I barely breathed. For what felt like minutes, we just stood there, me inside, her outside, both frozen in place. Then, slowly, she turned and walked back into the trees. I watched until she disappeared. I tried to tell myself that she was just some lost hiker. Maybe she lived nearby and had wandered too far. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. There was something deliberate about the way she had been standing there. Something unsettling about how she had just watched me without saying a word. I locked the door. The rest of the night was restless. I kept hearing noises, branches snapping, leaves crunching. But every time I looked out the window, there was nothing there. By the time morning came, I was exhausted. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving back home, but a part of me felt ridiculous. It was just one weird moment. I couldn't let my mind get carried away. The day passed without incident. I went for a hike, made lunch, tried to enjoy the peace and quiet. But as evening approached, the feeling of unease returned. I kept glancing toward the woods, half expecting to see her again. And then, as the last light of the sun faded, I did. She was standing closer this time, not at the tree line, but near the shed. And this time, she was facing away from me. Her posture was rigid, unnatural, like she was listening for something. I didn't move. I just watched. Then, without warning, she took a step toward the cabin, and then another. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a fire poker, and backed up. She kept coming. Not fast, not slow, just steady. I didn't wait any longer. I moved toward the back door, threw it open, and ran. I didn't stop. Not when I reached my car, not when I fumbled with the keys, not even when I got the engine started and tore down the dirt road. I didn't stop until I reached town. I ended up booking a hotel for the night, too shaken to drive all the way home. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing there, unmoving, listening. The next morning, I called Mark, told him what had happened. He was quiet for a long time before finally saying, "Yeah, I saw her too. I never went back." I never liked hunting alone. I knew men who did it, who took some kind of pride in isolating themselves in the wild, cutting off all human contact for a few days to be alone with their thoughts and the sound of the woods. I wasn't one of those men. I liked the company, the security of knowing someone else was keeping watch, that I wasn't the only pair of eyes scanning the trees or ears listening for something unnatural in the underbrush. But that year, circumstances forced my hand. I had taken a week off from work and planned a trip with my cousin, Eric, but he backed out at the last minute because his wife was expecting earlier than planned. My usual backup, my longtime hunting buddy Mark, had work commitments he couldn't get out of. I almost canceled the trip entirely, but I had already set everything up, requested time off, packed my gear, checked the maps, even prepped the cabin I'd be using. I figured I could handle it for just a few nights. I'd been hunting these woods since I was in my 20s, and they never gave me trouble. The cabin was deep in the woods, about a 5-hour drive from my house, and nearly an hour from the nearest paved road. It was an old, single-room hunting cabin built in the 50s, sturdy enough to last but basic. No running water, no electricity, just a wood stove, a cot, and a small table. It sat at the edge of a clearing, with thick trees surrounding it on three sides and a slope leading down to a creek in the back. The first day went as planned. I arrived in the afternoon, settled in, and spent the rest of the evening scouting a few spots where I'd seen deer on past trips. The air was crisp, the sky overcast. I set up a tree stand a few hundred yards from the cabin and checked for tracks. The woods were quiet, which I didn't think much of at the time. The second day, I headed out early, rifle slung over my shoulder. I sat in the stand for hours, barely moving. The forest was still, too still. No birds, no distant rustling of small animals moving through the undergrowth. I saw nothing, not even a squirrel. It was odd, but not unheard of. Sometimes the woods went quiet, and the animals moved somewhere else for a while. At noon, I climbed down and walked further into the woods, looking for fresh signs of movement. That's when I found the first carcass. It was a deer, what was left of it. The body had been torn apart, not eaten, just shredded. Its head was intact, tilted at an odd angle, but its torso was a mess of torn flesh and exposed bone. The legs had been pulled away from the body, not chewed off, but ripped clean from the sockets. It wasn't a kill from a hunter, and it wasn't the work of wolves or a bear. There were no bite marks, no sign of anything feeding, just destruction. I crouched near the remains, scanning the ground. There were no tracks. The leaves and dirt around the carcass were undisturbed. It was as if the deer had been killed and dropped there from above. The air smelled of iron and decay, sharp enough to make me step back. Something wasn't right. I left the carcass and walked back to the cabin, rifle in hand, ears straining for any sound. The woods stayed silent. I told myself it was a freak occurrence, a wounded deer that got attacked by something desperate or a poacher who killed for sport and left the body behind. But the unease stayed with me. That night, I sat inside the cabin with the door locked, listening to the woods. The wind picked up, and rain started falling, tapping against the metal roof. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard something outside, a soft, steady sound, footsteps in the wet leaves. I sat up slowly, reaching for my rifle. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear past the rain. Nothing, just the wind pushing against the trees. I told myself it was a deer or some other animal moving through the brush, and I lay back down, gripping the rifle tightly. But I didn't sleep. The third day, I found another carcass. This one was closer to the cabin. Another deer torn apart in the same way. And this time there was something else. A set of deep scratches in the tree beside the body, long and deliberate. Not claw marks from a bear, something else. I was done. I packed my things and decided to leave before the sun went down. I'd never abandoned a hunting trip before, but something about those woods felt wrong. I locked up the cabin, loaded my gear into the truck, and started down the narrow dirt road that led back to the highway. It was slow going. The rain had turned the road into mud, and I had to keep my speed low to avoid sliding into the trees. About 10 minutes into the drive, I saw movement in the trees to my left, something large, keeping pace with my truck. I didn't get a good look at it, just a dark shape moving fast, too fast for anything on two legs, but the wrong size for anything on four. It was just a glimpse, a shadow against the trees, but it was enough. I slammed my foot on the gas, the truck fishtailing in the mud. The shadow stayed with me for another few seconds, then veered off into the woods. I didn't slow down until I hit the paved road, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I never went back to that cabin. I still hunt, but only with others. I don't talk about what I saw. I don't have an explanation for it, but I know that something was out there in those woods with me. And whatever it wasn't hunting to eat. It was hunting to kill. I I had always been the kind of person who liked to be alone. Solitude never bothered me. If anything, I preferred it. That's why I took up a job working as a fire lookout deep in the high desert of Nevada. The job was simple: keep an eye out for wildfires, log any signs of smoke, and report unusual activity. I spent weeks at a time in a remote cabin, miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but dry, twisted trees, rocky hills, and an endless sky. The isolation didn't scare me. I enjoyed the quiet, but after what happened that summer, I don't think I could ever go back. It started in early June. The fire season had just begun, and I was stationed at one of the older cabins, built decades ago by the Forest Service. It was nothing fancy, just a one-room structure with a cot, a wood stove, and a radio for communication. I had a generator that powered a single light bulb and a small fridge. Water came from a well out back, and I had a rifle for emergencies. The nearest ranger station was about 40 miles away, and the closest town was even further. The only way in or out was by an old dirt road that twisted through the hills. Once you were up there, you were truly on your own. The first few days passed quietly. I did my rounds, checking for smoke and making notes in my logbook. At night, I sat on the porch, staring at the endless stars above, listening to the wind howl through the dry brush. The desert could be strangely beautiful at night, the way the landscape stretched out for miles, silent and untouched. Then, on the fourth night, I noticed something strange. I was sitting outside as usual, enjoying the cool air, when I heard something moving in the brush. It wasn't the wind, this was different. It was slow, deliberate, like footsteps. I turned off my lantern and listened. Crunch. A single step. Then nothing. I gripped my rifle and scanned the tree line. The moon was bright enough that I could see the outlines of the twisted pinyon pines, their branches casting long shadows across the ground. But I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Probably just a deer, I told myself, or a coyote. I went inside and locked the door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the trees, watching. By morning, I had convinced myself I had imagined it. I went about my usual routine, checking my maps, scanning the horizon for smoke, making sure the generator had fuel. The day passed uneventfully, and by nightfall, I had nearly forgotten about the noise, until I saw the figure. It was just after sunset. I was standing on the porch, sipping a cup of coffee, when I spotted movement near the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was something else. A man. He was standing about 50 yards away, half hidden behind a tree. His body was rigid, unmoving. I couldn't make out his face, but something about the way he stood made my skin crawl. He was too still, too silent. I called out, but he didn't respond. He didn't move at all. A cold wave of fear washed over me. What the hell was he doing all the way out here? There were no trails, no campsites, no reason for anyone to be wandering around this deep in the wilderness. I stepped inside and locked the door, keeping my rifle close. I sat there in the dark, heart pounding, listening. Hours passed. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Crunch. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. I gripped the rifle and held my breath. Then scraping. A soft, dragging sound against the wooden walls of the cabin. It stopped near the window. I couldn't see outside, but I could feel it. Someone or something was right there. Then a low whisper. Not words, just a sound. A breath, almost like a sigh. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept over the hills, the presence faded. The footsteps retreated, vanishing into the desert. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I searched the area, looking for tracks. I found them near the tree line, deep human-like prints in the dry dirt. but they weren't quite right. The spacing was off, the shape too long, the toes too pointed. I followed them for about 100 yards before they disappeared. No sign of where they led. No sign of where they came from. That night, I barricaded the door. I tried to radio the ranger station, but the static was too heavy. The following night was worse. The figure returned. This time, it came closer. I heard it circling the cabin, its footsteps unnaturally slow, like it was deliberately making me aware of its presence. Then I heard something else, a sound that made my blood turn to ice. My own voice, outside. In the darkness, I heard it calling my name. It was wrong. The tone was off, the cadence unnatural. It was like someone had recorded my voice and was playing it back through an old speaker, slightly distorted, stretched in a way that made it sound inhuman. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there, gripping my rifle, waiting for dawn. By the time the sun rose, the voice was gone. I left that morning. I packed up whatever I could carry and drove the long, winding road back to town without looking back. I didn't even tell my supervisor why I left. I just quit. I never went back to that cabin. A few years later, I met a ranger who had taken over my old post. I asked him how it was out there, trying to sound casual. He gave me a strange look and told me he had quit too. Said he heard things at night. Said he saw something standing near the trees. Said he heard his own voice whispering to him in the dark. I never spoke about it again. I don't know what was out there, and I don't want to know. All I know is that something was watching me, and it wanted me to come outside. I had been working as a police officer for nearly 8 years when I was assigned to a remote station in a rural part of Montana. The town itself was small, barely a few hundred people, but the land stretched for miles, mostly dense forests and open fields. It was the kind of place where you could drive for hours and not see a single house. People here kept to themselves, and crime was rare, mostly petty theft or disputes between neighbors. The station wasn't much of a station at all. It was a single-room cabin sitting at the edge of a long, winding dirt road, surrounded by nothing but trees. It had been built decades ago, back when the area had more logging activity. The county never saw the need to upgrade it. Inside, it was basic: one desk, a radio, a couple of filing cabinets, and a cot in the corner for overnight shifts. There was no proper holding cell, just a locked storage closet that we occasionally used to detain drunks until they sobered up. Most nights were quiet. The job was mostly sitting at the desk, listening to the radio, and sometimes driving out to check on abandoned properties that people called in about. The locals were paranoid about trespassers, though we rarely found anything when we investigated. That night, I was scheduled for the graveyard shift, midnight to 8 in the morning. My partner, Officer Reeves, had taken the earlier shift, and when I arrived, he looked relieved to see me. He handed over the keys and gave me a tired nod before heading out. "Nothing to report," he said. "That was normal." I nodded back, watching as he pulled his jacket tight against the cold and walked out to his truck. The gravel crunched under his boots, and then he was gone, his taillights disappearing into the darkness. I locked the door behind him and sat at the desk. The cabin was dimly lit, the single bulb overhead buzzing faintly. I switched on the radio, listening to static for a moment before tuning it to the sheriff's frequency. A few voices crackled through, mostly deputies from a neighboring town checking in. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled. 8 hours to go. The first couple of hours passed in silence. I made rounds inside the cabin, checked the perimeter, and wrote up a few reports for minor incidents that had happened earlier in the week. Just before 3 a.m., I stepped outside to stretch my legs. The cold air bit at my face, and I could see my breath in the light from the porch lamp. The forest was silent, the trees barely swaying in the stillness. Something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but standing there on the porch, I felt watched. I turned, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. The only sound was the distant hoot of an owl. I shook it off and went back inside. It was easy to get paranoid out here. Hours of isolation played tricks on your mind. I sat back at the desk and checked the radio again. Still nothing. Then, at 3:27 a.m., a call came through. County dispatch to Station 4. Do you copy? I grabbed the radio and pressed the button. Station 4. Go ahead. Got a report of a vehicle abandoned off Route 17 near the old sawmill. Caller said it's been sitting there for hours. No sign of the driver. Can you check it out? I hesitated. Route 17 was nearly a 30-minute drive through back roads. Normally, I'd wait until morning to check something like that, but we didn't get many calls this late. Copy that, I said. Heading out now. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. My cruiser was parked next to the cabin, covered in a thin layer of frost. I climbed in, started the engine, and turned on the heat. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something moving in the trees. Nothing, just my imagination. The drive was slow. The road was rough, mostly gravel, and the deeper I went, the thicker the trees became. There were no streetlights out here, only the high beams cutting through the dark. When I reached the sawmill, I spotted the vehicle immediately. A dark sedan, its hazard lights faintly blinking. It was parked just off the road, partially hidden by the trees. I pulled up behind it, radioed in my location, and stepped out. The air was still. No wind, no sound. Just that pressing silence that made my skin crawl. I approached the car carefully, one hand resting on my holster. The driver's side door was open. The interior light was on, casting a dim glow on the ground. I peered inside. Empty. No keys in the ignition, no signs of struggle. A jacket lay on the passenger seat, and a half-empty bottle of water sat in the cup holder. I clicked on my flashlight and scanned the ground. Footprints, leading into the woods. My gut told me to wait for backup, but I knew the nearest deputy was at least 45 minutes away. If someone was lost or hurt, they wouldn't last that long in the cold. I followed the tracks. The trees swallowed the light from my flashlight as I moved deeper. The footprints were uneven, like whoever made them was stumbling. About 50 yards in, I found something. A shoe. A single, black sneaker, half buried in the frost-covered leaves. I bent down to examine it. It was damp, the laces untied. Then I heard it. A rustling sound. Close. I turned, flashlight beam sweeping the trees. Nothing. Then footsteps. Fast, heavy, coming from behind me. I spun around just as something crashed through the underbrush. My hand went to my gun, but before I could react, a figure barreled past me, almost knocking me over. A man, pale, wide-eyed, wearing a torn jacket. He didn't stop. He didn't even look at me. He just ran, disappearing into the darkness. I shouted after him, but he didn't respond. I ran back to my cruiser and called it in. The dispatcher told me to hold my position until backup arrived. 15 minutes later, 2 deputies showed up. We searched the woods, but the man was gone. We towed the car back to the station. The next morning, we ran the plates. The car belonged to a man reported missing 2 days earlier. He had last been seen in a town over 100 miles away. We never found him. His wallet was in the car. His phone had no recent calls. No explanation. I transferred out of that station a month later. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about that man. Running through the woods. Not towards something, but away from it. And whatever it was still out there. It was late October when I took the trip out to my uncle's old hunting cabin. The cabin sat deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by thick trees and uneven terrain. It had been in my family for years, though no one had used it much after my uncle passed away a decade ago. It was old, isolated, and falling apart in some places, but it was still standing. I had no real reason to go out there other than wanting some time away. Life had been dragging me down, and I needed space to think. The idea of staying out in the woods for a few days seemed like the kind of escape I needed. I packed my truck with supplies, food, water, a rifle, and plenty of warm clothes. The forecast showed cold weather with chances of rain, but I didn't mind. The drive took me longer than expected. The roads leading up to the cabin were rough, barely maintained, and covered in fallen leaves that hid deep potholes. My tires crunched over the gravel as I navigated the winding path, the trees closing in around me the farther I went. It was early afternoon when I finally arrived. The cabin looked exactly how I remembered it. A small, single-story wooden structure with a covered porch and a tin roof. The windows were dusty, the door slightly warped from years of weather. It was nothing special, just a place meant for hunting trips and weekend getaways. But it felt safe, or at least it used to. I parked the truck, unloaded my gear, and stepped inside. The air was stale, carrying the scent of aged wood and dust. A single table with 2 chairs stood in the center of the room, a small kitchen to the left, and a fireplace against the far wall. A door led to the bedroom, where an old cot sat against the wall. It wasn't much, but it would do. I spent the next hour cleaning up, wiping dust off surfaces, checking the fireplace, and making sure the place was still sturdy enough to stay in. Once I was settled, I took a short walk around the property, the sound of leaves crunching beneath my boots breaking the silence. The forest was quiet, with only the occasional rustling of branches in the wind. As evening settled in, I started a fire in the fireplace and heated up a can of chili. The warmth filled the room, and I sat at the table, staring at the flames, lost in thought. It felt good to be away from everything, away from people, away from the noise of life. I went to bed early, exhaustion from the day settling in fast. The cot was uncomfortable, the blankets thin, but I was too tired to care. The sound of the wind outside was steady, and after a while, I drifted off to sleep. I woke up to a sound. At first, I wasn't sure if I had imagined it or if it was just the wind. I lay still, listening, my breath slow. Then I heard it again, a soft thud, like something moving outside. I sat up, heart pounding, and reached for the rifle beside my bed. The cabin was pitch black, the fire having burned low. I listened, my grip tightening on the gun. The sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps, not the sound of an animal, but something heavier. Someone walking. I swallowed hard and stood up, moving carefully toward the window. The glass was dirty, but I could see just enough outside. The moonlight cast long shadows across the ground, and for a moment, I saw nothing. But then movement near the trees. A figure, standing still, facing the cabin. My blood ran cold. The figure didn't move, didn't shift. It just stood there, watching. I didn't breathe, didn't blink. My hands tightened around the rifle, my body frozen in place. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, that maybe it was just a trick of the light. But then the figure took a slow step forward. I backed away from the window. The air in the cabin suddenly felt suffocating. I had locked the door when I arrived. I was sure of it, but doubt crept in. I moved toward it, checking the handle. It was still locked. The footsteps outside grew louder. Whoever it was, they were coming closer. I raised the rifle, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then silence. The footsteps stopped. I waited, my muscles tense. Minutes passed. Nothing. Had they left? I stood there for what felt like hours, my ears straining to pick up any sound. Finally, After what seemed like forever, I moved back to the cot, gun still in hand. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came slowly. The first thing I did was check outside. There were footprints in the dirt, deep, fresh, leading up to the cabin and stopping just outside the window. Whoever it was had been standing there for a long time. I scanned the woods, looking for any sign of movement, but the forest was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I considered packing up and leaving, but something in me refused. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe I just didn't want to let fear chase me away. Either way, I stayed. I spent the day gathering firewood, keeping an eye on the tree line. Nothing seemed out of place. The sun hung low in the sky by the time I returned to the cabin. I locked the door, checked the rifle, and waited. It happened again. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. The slow, deliberate sound of footsteps outside. I sat up, my grip on the rifle tight. The footsteps circled the cabin, moving slowly, deliberately. They stopped near the front door. Then the handle moved. A slow, careful turn. Locked. The sound stopped. Silence. Then a knock. A single, soft knock. I didn't move. Another knock. Then nothing. The silence stretched on, but I knew whoever was out there was still standing on the other side. I stayed awake all night. Morning brought a terrible sight. More footprints. More signs of someone watching. But this time I found something worse. A knife, stabbed into the wooden railing of the porch. A warning. I didn't hesitate anymore. I packed up my things, threw them in the truck, and got the hell out of there. The whole drive back, I checked the mirror, expecting to see something following me. But I never did. I never found out who it was. Never went back to the cabin. Some places are better left abandoned. And some people wait in the dark, watching. Started as a job. Just another contract, another project in the middle of nowhere. The kind of work that paid well because most people didn't want to do it. We were hired to build a cabin deep in the woods for a client who wanted something off-grid. No power lines, no roads, nothing but trees, dirt, and whatever we brought with us. The job was supposed to take 6 weeks. The company provided everything we needed: tools, materials, supplies, and even a small prefab cabin for us to stay in while we worked. It wasn't luxury, but it was enough. Just 4 of us out there, working from dawn to dusk, cutting wood, laying the foundation, piecing together something that would eventually stand strong against the elements. The first week was fine. Hard work, long days, but nothing unexpected. The only real problem was the isolation. There was no cell service, no contact with the outside world unless we drove an hour back to the nearest town. But we were used to that. We'd built cabins before, sometimes in places even more remote than this. It was around the second week that things started feeling off. We found footprints, not ours. At first, I thought maybe the client had come to check on us. Some people like to see the progress for themselves, even if they had to hike miles through rough terrain to do it. But when I looked closer, I knew something wasn't right. The footprints were deep, uneven, like whoever left them was dragging their feet. And there were a lot of them circling our worksite, weaving between the trees, overlapping in a way that made no sense. That night, none of us talked about it. Maybe we were all thinking the same thing. Animals, erosion, maybe even just our own tracks getting messed up by the wind and rain. But the next day, we saw them again. More of them, fresh ones. That's when I started feeling it. It's hard to explain that kind of feeling to someone who's never been out there, in a place where there's nothing but trees and silence. It's not fear, not at first. It's something quieter, a kind of awareness that creeps into your bones. The sense that you're not alone, even when you should be. We worked harder after that, faster. The The sooner we finished, the sooner we could leave. By the third week, things got worse. It wasn't just the footprints anymore. Tools started disappearing. At first, it was small things, screws, nails, a wrench here and there. Things that could be misplaced, lost in the dirt or under piles of lumber. But then it was bigger things. A saw, a hammer, an entire stack of boards we were sure we had cut the day before. It didn't make sense. We searched the whole site, even checked the storage shed we had set up near the prefab cabin. Nothing. Then one night we heard something. It was late, well past the time any of us should have been awake. The rain had come in hard that evening, drumming against the roof, turning the dirt outside into thick mud. I had been trying to sleep when I heard it. Movement outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps, just beyond the walls of our cabin. I held my breath, listening. The others must have heard it too because the whole room felt tense, the air thick with something I didn't have a name for. The footsteps stopped. Then a sound against the wall. A soft, scraping noise, like something being dragged across the wood. None of us moved. It lasted for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was probably just a minute or two. Then silence. The next morning, we found more footprints. Deep ones, leading from the trees to our cabin, circling around it before disappearing back into the woods. The mud had caught them perfectly, large, misshapen, some looking like bare feet, others like something else entirely. We kept working. We didn't have a choice. By the fourth week, we had started keeping a fire going at night. It didn't do much to ease the feeling, but it gave us something to focus on. A barrier, even if it was just in our heads. One night, I was the last one awake, sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, listening to the sounds of the woods. That's when I saw it. Movement, just beyond the tree line. I couldn't see clearly, not in the darkness, but there was something there. A shape, a figure standing just beyond the light of the fire, watching. I didn't move. It didn't either. I don't know how long we stayed like that, locked in some silent standoff, but eventually, I blinked and it was gone. The next morning, I told myself I imagined it, that it was just shadows playing tricks on me. But I knew better. We were being watched. The last 2 weeks were the hardest. We barely spoke, barely slept, just worked. Every day we checked our supplies, counted our tools, made sure nothing else had gone missing. One morning, we found something on the work site. A single boot, old and torn, caked in dried mud. Not ours. We finished early. By the end of the 5th week, the cabin was done. The client wasn't supposed to come for another few days, but we didn't care. We packed up, loaded the truck, and drove out without looking back. We never talked about it after that. A few months later, I heard that the cabin burned down. No one knew how it started. No one knew if anyone had been inside when it happened. No one asked. I never went back, and I never will. I had never been the type to get scared easily. I had spent years working in remote areas, taking on jobs that required me to be alone for long stretches. Solitude never bothered me. I liked the silence, the sense of being away from the chaos of cities. So when I was offered a job to renovate an old cabin deep in the French countryside, I didn't hesitate. It seemed like an easy task. Fix up the roof, reinforce the structure, replace some old floorboards. A few weeks of work and I'd be done. The cabin belonged to a man named Julian, an older guy who had inherited it from his father. It had been in his family for generations, but years of neglect had left it in rough shape. The location was isolated, surrounded by dense woods, with only a narrow dirt road leading up to it. There were no neighbors, no passing cars, just endless trees stretching out in every direction. The closest town was over an hour away. Perfect, I thought. I could work without distractions. The first day, I arrived in the late afternoon. The drive had been long, and the road leading to the cabin was rough, barely more than a trail cutting through the trees. The moment I stepped out of my truck, I noticed how quiet it was. Not just the usual quiet you expect in the woods, but a deeper kind of silence.
No birds.
No rustling leaves, just the wind moving through the trees. The cabin itself was in worse shape than I expected. The wood was old and warped from years of exposure to rain and snow. The roof sagged slightly in the middle. Some of the windows were cracked. The front door had deep scratches on it, like something had clawed at it. I assumed it was just wear and tear, maybe animals trying to get in. Inside, it was dusty and smelled like damp wood. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and there were old pictures on the walls, black and white photos of people from another time. Julian had told me I could stay in the cabin while I worked. There was no electricity, but there was an old wood stove for warmth. I had brought supplies, canned food, a flashlight, a battery-powered lantern, enough to last me until the job was done. That first night, I settled in. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. I fell asleep easily, exhausted from the drive. I woke up to a sound in the middle of the night, something moving outside, a slow, deliberate crunching of leaves. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, but then the footsteps stopped right outside the cabin. Close, too close. I held my breath, listening. The sound didn't continue. After a few minutes, I convinced myself I had imagined it and went back to sleep. The next day, I got to work. I started with the roof, climbing up to remove the damaged shingles. The sun was bright, and for most of the day, everything felt normal. The only strange thing was the constant feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked over my shoulder, the woods seemed different, like the trees had shifted slightly. That evening, I sat outside eating a can of cold beans, watching the sun dip below the trees. That's when I noticed something strange. There were no tracks around the cabin. If an animal had been outside my window last night, there should have been tracks in the soft dirt. But there was nothing.
No prints.
No signs of movement. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing sounds, branches snapping, leaves rustling. At one point, something knocked against the side of the cabin. Hard. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it out the window. Nothing. The days passed, and the feeling of unease only grew. Every night, the noises returned. They weren't random. They followed a pattern, circling the cabin, stopping at the windows. One night, I found the front door open, even though I had locked it. I started working faster, determined to finish the job and leave. But something about the place felt wrong. I kept noticing small things. My tools would be in different places than where I left them. My flashlight disappeared for a full day, only to turn up inside a cabinet I hadn't even opened. The worst night was my last. I had finished most of the work and was planning to leave the next morning. I packed my things, made sure my truck was ready to go. That night, the noises started earlier, louder. I sat on my bed, gripping my flashlight, listening. Then, around midnight, something slammed against the back wall of the cabin. The whole structure shook. I jumped up, heart pounding. The wind outside had died completely, leaving only silence. And then footsteps, slow, heavy, coming from the back of the cabin, moving toward the front door. I held my breath, waiting. The footsteps stopped just outside. Then scratching. Long, slow scratches against the wood. I grabbed my knife, my hands slick with sweat. The scratching stopped, and for the longest moment, there was nothing. Then the doorknob started to turn. I lunged forward, slamming the lock into place. Silence. My breathing was too loud in the quiet. Then faintly laughter. Low, almost a whisper. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the corner, knife in hand, waiting for morning. As soon as the first light broke through the trees, I threw my things into my truck and left. I didn't look back. I never told Julian what happened. I finished the work, left my final report, and took my payment. I never went back. A few months later, I got a call from another worker who had been hired to do some additional repairs. I didn't pick up, but he left a message. He had arrived at the cabin, found my work completed. But something was wrong, he said. The front door was wide open. Inside, there were deep scratches on the walls, and on the floor in the dust were footprints.
Bare footprints.
Leading from the door to the bed where I had slept, and then stopping, like someone had been standing there, watching, waiting. It was 2012 when I took the job. A man I barely knew, a friend of a friend, needed help fixing up an old hunting cabin deep in the Oregon woods. The pay was decent and I had nothing tying me down, so I figured, why not? I had done a few carpentry jobs before, enough to get by, and this guy, Daniel, said it would be simple work. Replace some rotting wood, patch up the roof, maybe reinforce the porch. Daniel wasn't coming with me. He gave me the keys, some instructions, and an old pickup to haul my supplies. The cabin was a good 3-hour drive from the nearest town, and once I turned off the main road, it was another hour down a winding dirt path, trees closing in from all sides. The first thing I noticed when I pulled up was how old the place was. The wood was gray with age, the roof sagged slightly, and the porch looked like one wrong step would send it crashing down. It wasn't abandoned. There were old footprints in the dirt, tire tracks that looked fresh. Someone had been here recently. Inside, the place smelled like damp wood and dust. There was furniture, but everything was old, worn-out couches, a kitchen table covered in scratches, a wood-burning stove with black soot lining the edges. The bedroom had a single bed, the mattress thin and stained. I unpacked my things, set up a small work area, and by evening I had a fire going in the stove. Outside, the woods were quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I tried not to think about how far I was from anyone else. The first few nights were uneventful. I woke up with the sunrise, spent the day repairing the porch, replacing warped planks, and clearing out debris. At night, I made simple meals on a gas stove, read old magazines I found in the cabin, and went to bed early. But by the fourth night, I started hearing things. It wasn't animals. I had grown up in a rural area. I knew the sounds of raccoons, coyotes, even bears. This was different. It started with footsteps, soft, deliberate, crunching on the gravel outside the cabin. I lay still, listening, heart pounding. The footsteps circled the cabin once, twice, then stopped near the front porch. I waited, gripping the knife I kept near my bed. Minutes passed. Then, a slow, deliberate knock at the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. No one should be out here. I waited until the fire in the stove died down and the cabin was pitch black. No more footsteps. No more knocks. The next day, I told myself it was my imagination. Maybe an animal had wandered onto the porch. Maybe I was just paranoid, being alone in the woods. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I felt it. The trees felt too still, the air too heavy. On the 7th day, I found something that made my stomach drop. A single boot print, half covered in mud, just behind the cabin. It wasn't mine. It was fresh. Someone had been standing there, watching. I checked the perimeter, found no other tracks leading to or away from it. Whoever left it had been careful. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat in the darkness, listening. Nothing. Then, around midnight, the noise started again. Not footsteps this time, just breathing. Slow, steady breathing, just outside the cabin walls. I stayed awake until sunrise, knife in hand. The next morning, I decided I needed to leave. But I had one last thing to check. The basement. I hadn't gone down there yet. The door was locked with a heavy iron latch, and I hadn't thought much about it. But now something felt off. I pried it open with a crowbar and descended the wooden steps. The air was cold, damp, thick with the smell of earth. The basement was small, just a dirt floor and wooden walls lined with old shelves. And then I saw it. A pile of old clothes neatly folded in the corner. Men's clothes, dirty, torn, but carefully arranged. Next to them, a small tin cup, a used toothbrush. Someone had been living here. Recently. I backed up slowly, heart hammering. As I turned to run, I saw something else. Deep scratch marks on the inside of the basement door. Long, deep grooves like someone had tried to claw their way out. I didn't pack my things. I didn't lock up. I just ran. By the time I reached the truck, the sun was setting. I climbed in, turned the key, nothing. Dead. Then, from the tree line, movement. A figure standing just beyond the trees. Tall, thin, dressed in dark clothes. Watching. I didn't hesitate. I jumped out, grabbed the emergency gas can from the back, and ran down the dirt road. I didn't look back. I ran until my legs gave out. It took me hours to reach a gas station, where I called the police. They found the cabin. They found the basement, but they never found him. Just the clothes, the scratch marks, the boot print in the mud. And one more thing. Near the back of the cabin, etched into the wood, were the words, "I watch you sleep." I never planned to stay at the cabin. It was just supposed to be a stop along the way, a place to catch my breath and get some sleep before continuing my trip. But I ended up staying much longer than I wanted. I had been driving across the country, taking the back roads, trying to get away from everything. It was late October, and the cold had started to settle in. The trees were mostly bare, their twisted branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The roads were empty, the air crisp and dry. I hadn't seen another car in hours. I wasn't even sure where I was exactly. Somewhere deep in the woods, far from any town or gas station. I had taken a wrong turn off the highway and ended up on a narrow dirt road that wound through the forest. My gas gauge was getting low, and my phone had lost signal miles back. Then I saw it. A cabin sitting alone in a small clearing. It looked old but sturdy. The wood was dark and weathered, the roof slightly slanted. A small porch wrapped around the front, with a single wooden chair sitting next to the door. There were no lights, no signs of life, but there was a driveway leading up to it. If you could even call it that, just 2 tire tracks cutting through the grass. I pulled up and killed the engine. I wasn't sure why I stopped. Maybe I thought someone could help me with directions. Maybe I just wanted a place to rest for a while. I got out of the car. The air was completely still. No wind, no rustling leaves. Nothing. It was too quiet. Even the birds were silent. I walked up the steps and knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. The door creaked slightly from the force, but still nothing. I tried the handle. Unlocked. I hesitated. I knew I shouldn't go inside, but I was exhausted. My head was pounding from the long drive, and I hadn't eaten in hours. I stepped inside. The cabin was small, just one big room with a bed against the far wall, a wood stove in the corner, and a tiny kitchen area with an old table and 2 chairs. There was a musty smell, like damp wood and dust. A single window let in what little light was left in the evening sky. There were no signs that anyone lived there. No personal belongings, no food in the cupboards, no pictures on the walls. It felt abandoned. But the bed was made. The floor was clean. Someone had been here. I tried not to think about it. I told myself it didn't matter. I just needed a few hours of sleep, and then I'd be on my way. I shut the door behind me, locked it, and sat on the edge of the bed. My body ached from driving all day. I told myself I'd just rest my eyes for a few minutes. I woke up to darkness. The only light came from the moon outside, casting long shadows across the floor. My mouth was dry, my body stiff. I had slept longer than I meant to. Then I heard it, a soft creaking sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was no wind. The sound came again, slow, deliberate, like footsteps. My heart started pounding. I sat up, straining to hear. Silence. I told myself it was nothing, just the old wood settling. Then, another sound. Not footsteps this time. Something scraping came from outside, near the porch. I held my breath. The scraping continued, slow and steady, moving along the wooden boards. I forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady. I crept toward the window, careful not to make a sound. I peered outside. Nothing. Just the trees, the empty road, the dark outline of my car. I waited. Nothing happened. Maybe it was an animal, a raccoon or a stray dog. I turned away from the window and froze. The door, the lock, it was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it. I reached out, heart hammering, and slowly turned the knob. Locked. I stared at it, my breathing shallow. Had I imagined it? Had I been too tired to remember? I didn't sleep again that night. I sat in the chair by the stove, staring at the door until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. As soon as the sun was up, I grabbed my keys and stepped outside. The porch looked normal. No signs of anything unusual. But as I walked down the steps, something caught my eye. The ground. There were footprints. Not boot prints. Not shoe prints. Bare feet. Large, misshapen, uneven. The toes too long, the heels too narrow. They led from the woods up onto the porch, and then back into the trees. I didn't hesitate. I ran to my car, started the engine, and peeled out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop driving. I didn't look back. I just kept going until I saw another car, another road sign, another gas station. I don't know who or what was in those woods that night, and I don't ever want to find out. I inherited my grandfather's old farm cabin in 2017, a place tucked deep into the countryside, far from the noise of the city. It wasn't a place I had ever planned on living in. It wasn't even a place I had many memories of, aside from a few childhood visits when my parents drove us out to see him. But when he passed away and left it to me, I figured I'd at least check it out before deciding what to do with it. The drive out was long, mostly empty roads cutting through fields that stretched for miles. The further I got from town, the more the land started to feel forgotten. Old barns stood half collapsed, weeds climbed over broken fences, and the farmhouses I passed looked abandoned. It was the kind of place where time had stopped moving. By the time I reached the property, the sun had already started dipping behind the hills. The cabin sat in the middle of an overgrown field, its wooden walls darkened by years of rain and neglect. The roof sagged slightly, and the front porch creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it. The key my grandfather left me barely worked in the rusted lock, and when I finally pushed the door open, the smell of dust and stale air rushed out to meet me. Inside, it was exactly as I remembered from childhood: dim, quiet, and filled with the same old furniture that had been there for decades. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, cold and unused. A single bed against the far wall was covered in a thick layer of dust. The kitchen area had a small sink, a battered old table, and shelves lined with jars of food that had probably expired years ago. It wasn't much, but it was still standing, and considering how much worse some of the other farmhouses I'd passed looked, that was saying something. I set my bag down and decided I'd spend a few nights here before figuring out what to do next. Maybe I'd fix it up and sell it, or maybe I'd just let it rot like the rest of the places around here. Either way, I needed to see it for myself. The first night was quiet, aside from the usual sounds of an old house settling. The wind howled through the trees outside, rattling against the loose boards on the windows. The floorboards creaked every time I moved, and every so often, I'd hear something scurry across the roof. Probably rats. It wasn't comfortable, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. It was the second night that things started to feel off. I had spent most of the day outside, clearing away some of the weeds that had grown up around the cabin. The land was still good, rich soil, plenty of space. If someone wanted to farm it again, they could. But as I worked, I kept getting this feeling like I was being watched. Every so often, I'd glance up toward the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The wind had died down, leaving the cabin almost too quiet. I could hear every little noise, the ticking of the clock on the wall, the faint scratching of something moving inside the walls. Then, sometime around midnight, I heard something else. Footsteps, not inside the cabin, but outside, moving through the grass. Slow, careful steps, like someone trying not to be heard. I held my breath, listening. The steps moved toward the front porch, then stopped. I waited, my ears straining in the silence. Nothing. After a long moment, I forced myself to get up. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe, or a stray dog. I grabbed the old shotgun my grandfather had left behind and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. I couldn't see anything. The yard stretched out in front of me, empty, the grass swaying gently. The only light came from the moon, casting long shadows across the ground. But something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I knew, deep down, that something had been out there. I barely slept that night. The next day, I checked around the cabin for tracks. The ground was dry and hard, but near the porch I found something. Faint impressions in the dirt, too big to be from an animal. Someone had been there. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just some drifter passing through, someone who saw the cabin and got curious. But that feeling of being watched didn't go away. It only got worse. That night, I locked the door and shut the windows tight. I kept the shotgun next to me, just in case. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Then, around midnight, the footsteps came back. Slow, deliberate, moving through the grass, circling the cabin. I sat up in bed, gripping the shotgun, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps stopped near the porch, just like before. Then came the sound of something brushing against the door. A light tap, almost like a knock. I didn't move. I just sat there listening, waiting. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care if I had to drive all the way back to town that day. I wasn't staying here another night. But when I stepped outside, something stopped me cold. In the dirt right outside the door were more footprints, deep, clear ones, and next to them something else. A single handprint pressed into the ground, fingers splayed wide. Someone had been crouching there, right outside my door. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my things, threw them in the truck, and got out of there as fast as I could. I never went back. The farm is still there. No one bought it. No one moved in. It just sits there, rotting just like the rest of the land around it. Sometimes I wonder who or what was out there that night, and sometimes I wonder if they're still waiting. It started as a side job, just a way to make extra money when work was slow. I'd done plenty of construction before, framing houses, putting up drywall, roofing, But this was something different. A guy I knew, Darren, had told me about it. Some rich guy owned a big chunk of land out in the middle of nowhere and wanted a cabin built, but he didn't want a big construction crew. Just a few workers, low-key, off the books. The pay was good. Too good. That should have been my first warning sign. The drive out there took forever. The land was deep in the woods, far from any towns, no phone service after a certain point. The last stretch of road wasn't even a road, just a long, muddy path that my truck barely handled. The site was isolated, surrounded by thick trees. No power lines, no other buildings, just emptiness. The materials were already dropped off. Lumber, nails, everything we needed. The only instructions we had were simple. Build the cabin exactly as planned, work fast, and don't ask questions. The blueprints weren't anything special, just a basic single-story cabin with a loft. But something about it felt off. The dimensions were strange. The way the rooms connected didn't make sense. And the location, it was in a small clearing, but way too deep in the woods for anyone who wanted to use it for hunting or a vacation home. First, it was just normal work. Darren and I got to cutting and framing, and the first couple of days went smoothly. The trees around us were thick. The air smelled like damp earth and sawdust. But by the third day, I started noticing little things. The first was the silence. Out in the woods, you expect to hear things. Birds whine through the trees, maybe a distant coyote. But after a certain time in the afternoon, everything would just go quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. Then there were the tracks. At first, I thought they were just from an animal, deep imprints in the mud around the site. But they weren't quite right. Too large to be a deer, too deep for a coyote. And they were close, too close to our work area, almost like something had been watching us. I tried to ignore it. We were getting paid well, and I just wanted to finish the job and leave. But then Darren found the bones. We were digging a hole for the foundation posts when his shovel hit something solid. He bent down, pulled it up, and we both just stood there staring. It was a bone, old and yellowed, too big to be from a deer or any small animal. Then we found another, and another. Darren didn't say much, just shook his head and tossed them aside. "Just animals," he muttered. But I could tell he didn't believe it. That night, we decided to stay at the site. It was too far to drive back and forth every day, and we had a tent set up not far from the build. I barely slept. I kept hearing noises, branches snapping, footsteps in the dirt. But every time I got up to check, nothing was there. The next morning, Darren was different. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept, and he was quiet, more focused on getting the work done fast. He wouldn't say why, but I could tell he wanted to leave as soon as possible. As the days passed, more things started to feel wrong. The cabin itself felt wrong. The way the walls went up, the way the light hit the wood, the way the rooms didn't feel like they belonged together. We had no idea who it was for, and the more we built, the more it felt like we shouldn't be there. Then, on the last night before we finished, I woke up to the sound of Darren moving around. I turned over in my sleeping bag and saw him standing just outside the tent, staring into the trees. His posture was stiff, like he was frozen in place. I whispered his name, but he didn't react. Then, slowly, he took a step forward. I scrambled up and grabbed his arm, shaking him hard. He blinked, like he was waking up from a dream, then looked at me, pale and shaking. "I thought I heard something," he muttered. The next morning, he was gone. I checked everywhere, around the site, down the trail, even back toward the road. His truck was still there, but he wasn't. His tools, his bag, all of it was untouched. I called his phone, but there was no service. I waited, thinking maybe he just went for a walk or needed a break, but he never came back. I should have left then, packed up and driven out of there, but I didn't. Maybe it was the money, maybe it was something else. I told myself I'd finish the job, just get it done and go. The last day I worked alone. The cabin was nearly complete, just a few final touches left. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. The trees felt closer, the silence heavier. As I hammered in the last nails, I looked up and saw something at the edge of the clearing. A shape just standing there, too still. I couldn't make out details, but I knew it wasn't Darren. I dropped my tools and backed away. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I grabbed my bag, ran to my truck, and didn't look back. I don't know what happened to Darren. I never found out who the cabin was for. A few weeks later, I went back just to see. The site was empty. No tools, no materials, nothing. But the cabin was still there, standing in the clearing. The door was open. I didn't go inside. I turned around and left. I never went back, and I never built another cabin again. I had never believed in bad omens, but the day I signed the lease for that cabin, something in my gut told me I had made a mistake. It was late autumn, the air crisp and damp, and the sky always seemed to be either overcast or darkening earlier than expected. I had been looking for an isolated place to live for a while, somewhere far from the constant noise of the city. When I found the listing for a cheap rental in the countryside, I didn't hesitate. The cabin sat on the edge of an old graveyard, the kind with headstones worn down so much you could barely read the names. The landowner, an older man who barely spoke, told me the cemetery had been there for more than 100 years. I didn't think much of it at the time. It wasn't a big graveyard, just a small patch of uneven land with maybe 20, 30 graves. Most of them were so old that they had sunk into the earth, only jagged stone edges peeking through the overgrown grass. The cabin itself was basic. A single-story wooden structure with a tin roof, a front porch that sagged in the middle, and 2 rooms inside, one for sleeping, one for everything else. The walls had a strange smell, like old wood and damp soil, but it was cheap and it was quiet. The first few nights passed without anything unusual happening. I spent my days fixing up the place, cleaning out the dust and patching up holes in the walls where the wind whistled through at night. There was no electricity, only a gas lamp I had brought with me, and no running water apart from the well a few meters from the front door. Then small things started to feel off. The first thing I noticed was the way the wind carried sound in that place. Sometimes, especially at night, I would hear what sounded like footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was just the sound of dry leaves rustling against the ground. But it wasn't just leaves. It was rhythmic, steady, almost like someone walking around the cabin. One night, I stepped outside with my flashlight. The air was thick with fog, the kind that made everything beyond a few feet disappear into a wall of gray. I swept the light around the yard. Nothing, just the gravestones barely visible in the mist, their shapes crooked and uneven in the dirt. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I just wasn't used to the stillness of the countryside. But the feeling of unease didn't go away. A week after moving in, I woke up to find the front door slightly open. Not wide, just enough for a sliver of cold air to creep in. I knew I had locked it before going to bed. I checked the lock. It was intact. No signs of forced entry. I told myself I must have forgotten to latch it properly, even though I was sure I hadn't. That morning, I went for a walk through the graveyard, just to clear my head. The grass was damp from the night's rain, and the fog was still clinging low to the ground. I took my time, reading the names on the gravestones, though most of them had eroded beyond recognition. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. Near the back of the graveyard, where the grass was the tallest, there was a grave with fresh dirt piled on top of it. It didn't make sense. The landowner had told me no one had been buried there in decades. The town had a new cemetery miles away, and this one had long been abandoned. But this dirt, it was loose, darker than the rest, like it had been recently turned over. I crouched down and ran my fingers through it. It was damp, clumpy, fresh. I stood there for a long time, staring at the disturbed earth, feeling my heartbeat in my ears. I didn't mention it to anyone. There wasn't anyone to mention it to. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I had no phone service out there. That night, I locked the door twice and kept my gas lamp burning longer than usual. I told myself I was being stupid, that maybe it was just an animal digging around. But I knew animals didn't dig a perfect, human-sized patch of dirt. I barely slept. Every sound outside made me sit up, listening, waiting. The wind creaked through the trees, leaves skittered across the roof, and somewhere in the distance, an owl let out a long, slow call. At some point, exhaustion won over fear, and I must have dozed off. When I woke up, it was still dark. I glanced at my watch, 3:47 a.m. My mouth was dry, my body stiff. Something had woken me up, but I didn't know what. I lay still, listening. Then I heard it. Not footsteps, not rustling leaves. Breathing. It was faint, just on the other side of the wall. Steady, slow, deliberate. My heart started pounding. I reached for the hunting knife I kept near my bed. My fingers tightened around the handle as I listened. The breathing didn't stop. It stayed there, just beyond the wall. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the front porch or the side of the cabin, but it was close. I didn't move. I barely breathed myself. Then, after what felt like forever, it stopped. Silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. I waited, gripping the knife so tight my knuckles ached. The air inside the cabin felt heavier than before. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the walls. When I finally found the courage to move, I crept to the front door and eased it open. The ground outside was damp from the morning dew, but there were no footprints. Nothing to suggest anyone had been there at all. I walked around the cabin, checking every side. Then I saw it. Near the graveyard, not far from the fresh dirt I had found the day before, there was another patch of disturbed soil. The same dark, loose earth. But this time something was missing. The first grave, the one I had found with fresh dirt on top, was now empty. A hole, deep and yawning, sat where it had been. The wooden coffin, the one that had been buried there, was gone. I turned and left the cabin that day. I didn't pack. I didn't look back. I walked straight to the road, waited for the first car to pass, and hitched a ride into town. A week later, I had a new place, a new job, and a new determination to never think about that cabin again. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding for no reason, I still hear it. The slow, steady sound of breathing just beyond the wall. And I wonder if whatever was in that grave ever really stopped looking for me. I was driving along the old country road, the kind that barely seemed like a road at all, just a narrow strip of cracked pavement swallowed up by towering trees and thick underbrush. It had been years since I'd been out this way. The last time was for my grandmother's funeral, and I hadn't had the stomach to come back since. But today something pulled me here. Maybe it was guilt or nostalgia, or just the need to see what had become of the old cabin she left behind. The sky was overcast, gray and heavy, the kind of weather that felt like a weight pressing down on you. It had been drizzling on and off all morning, and the dampness clung to everything. The air smelled of wet earth, pine, and the faint mustiness of decay that always seemed to linger in places that had been abandoned for too long. I slowed down as I neared the turnoff, barely visible beneath the overgrown brush. The dirt path leading to the cabin was still there, but it had been overtaken by weeds and saplings pushing their way through the soil. I hesitated before pulling in, feeling an unease settle into my bones. The place should have been comforting, it was my grandmother's after all, but something about it felt off. The cabin came into view, looking worse than I remembered. The wooden siding was warped and darkened with age, the roof sagging slightly. The front porch, once sturdy, now had missing planks, and the railing was barely holding on. The windows were dark, their glass smudged with years of neglect. The door still stood, though the paint was chipped away, revealing raw wood beneath. I stepped out of the car, my boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. The place was silent. No birds, no rustling of small animals, just the occasional drip of water falling from the trees. I walked up to the front door, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the quiet. The key still worked. The door groaned as I pushed it open, revealing the stale interior. The smell of dust, mildew, and aged wood filled my nostrils. Everything was just as she had left it. Her old rocking chair by the fireplace, the small wooden table with its scratched surface, the cabinets that probably still held jars of preserves she had made years ago. I walked through slowly, memories pressing against me from every direction. I could see her sitting by the fire, knitting, humming some old tune under her breath. I could hear the creak of the floorboards beneath her steps. But the cabin wasn't warm like it used to be. It felt cold, empty, hollow. I made my way to the back, to the bedroom she used to sleep in. The bed was still there, the blankets pulled up neatly, though they were covered in dust now. The dresser, the nightstand, the little mirror she used every morning. They were all untouched. I ran my fingers over the surface of the nightstand and felt the grit of dust and time. A strange unease settled over me. It wasn't grief. It wasn't sadness. It was something else, something deeper. I turned to leave, but then I saw it. The closet door slightly ajar. I didn't remember it being like that. Last time I had been here, I had made sure everything was closed up tight before I left. I stared at the narrow gap, at the darkness beyond it. My pulse quickened, and my hands felt suddenly cold. I stepped closer. The air inside the cabin felt heavier now, pressing in on me. I reached out and pulled the door open. Empty, just old coats, a few boxes, the lingering scent of mothballs. But something about it didn't sit right. I backed away, shaking my head. I was just getting paranoid. It was an old house, an old memory, and I was letting my mind play tricks on me. I turned back toward the living room and froze. The front door was open. I knew for a fact I had closed it behind me. A chill ran down my spine. The car was still outside. No sign of movement. No footprints in the damp ground. Just the open door yawning like a silent invitation. I stepped forward, slowly, my breathing controlled but shallow. Then I saw it. The dirt on the wooden floor. Fresh dirt, scattered just past the threshold. Someone had been here. I walked out onto the porch, scanning the tree line, my ears straining for any sound. But there was nothing, just the heavy silence of the forest pressing in around me. I swallowed hard and stepped back inside, locking the door this time. I didn't know why I stayed after that. Maybe I was trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I didn't want to let fear chase me out of my grandmother's house. But the feeling of being watched never left me. I checked the whole cabin, top to bottom. No sign of anyone. No forced entry. Nothing missing. And yet, the unease wouldn't go away. Night fell, and I found myself sitting in the old chair by the fireplace, a lantern flickering beside me. The sound of rain began to tap against the roof, slow and steady. The air felt thick, too quiet. Then I heard it, a creak, not from inside the cabin, from outside, right by the window. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just sat there, staring at the glass, at the reflection of the dim lantern flame. Another creak, closer this time. Someone was outside. I reached for the old rifle my grandmother used to keep by the door, though my hands were unsteady. I wasn't used to holding one, but I needed something, anything. Then silence. The rain kept falling, but there was no more movement, no more sounds. I stayed awake the whole night, watching, waiting, but nothing else happened. By morning, I forced myself to step outside. The ground was wet, the air thick with mist, and then I saw them. Footprints. They led from the edge of the woods, stopping right at the window where I had been sitting. But there were no prints leading away. Whoever had been watching me had never left. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my things, locked the cabin up tight, and left. I didn't look back. I never came back. The cabin stayed there, rotting, forgotten. Maybe someone else found it eventually. Maybe they didn't. All I knew was that something or someone had been waiting in those woods that night, and I had no intention of finding out who. I never wanted the cabin. It was left to me after my uncle passed away. A small one-room cabin in the middle of nowhere, deep in the forests of Montana. He had lived there alone for years, a man who never quite fit into normal life. When I was younger, I remembered him as the strange uncle who never showed up to family gatherings, never called, and never sent cards. My dad never talked about him much, except to say he had gone off the grid a long time ago. I had no plans to keep the place. I had a life in the city, a job, a place of my own. But I figured I would go up there, clean it out, and maybe sell it to someone who actually wanted to live in a cabin in the woods. I took a week off work, packed up my truck, and made the 8-hour drive out into the middle of nowhere. The closer I got, the more I understood why my uncle had chosen this place. It was quiet, isolated, the kind of place where you could go days without seeing another person. The trees stretched for miles in every direction, thick and dark. The road leading to the cabin was barely a road at all, just a narrow dirt path cutting through the woods. When I finally arrived, the place looked exactly how I expected. A small, weathered cabin with a rusted metal roof. A single window, the front door slightly warped from age. A woodpile stacked against the side. It had been months since my uncle had died, but everything was still there, untouched. I stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust and the smell of old wood. A small cot sat against the far wall, a few shelves lined with canned food, a table with a single chair. No electricity.
No plumbing.
A lantern sat on the table, half full of oil. A rifle rested on a rack above the door. Felt like stepping into another time. I spent the first day cleaning, sorting through my uncle's things. Most of it was junk, old clothes, worn-out boots, stacks of yellowed newspapers. But there were notebooks, too, dozens of them, stacked in a wooden crate under the cot. I flipped through a few, expecting to find notes, maybe old hunting logs. Instead, I found something else. Page after page, filled with frantic handwriting. Descriptions of animals that weren't animals. Stories of things moving through the trees at night, things that watched from the darkness. Warnings about never stepping outside after sundown. I put the notebooks away. By nightfall, I was exhausted. I had brought a sleeping bag and a cot of my own, figuring I'd at least stay a couple of nights. As the sun dipped below the trees, I lit the lantern, sat at the table, and ate a cold can of beans. Outside, the forest was silent. Not even the sound of crickets. That was the first night I heard it. A low, distant sound. Not an animal. Not the wind. Something else. It came from deep in the woods. A long, drawn-out wail. Almost human, but not quite. I set my spoon down, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. I stood up, grabbed the rifle from above the door. My heart was pounding. I told myself it was just an animal, something I wasn't familiar with. Mountain lions could scream like that, right? Or maybe an injured elk. I locked the door. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I started to drift off, I would hear something outside, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, soft, shuffling footsteps. Morning came slow. The second day, I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. I spent the daylight hours finishing the cleanup, stacking boxes near the door to load into the truck later. The woods felt different now. I had grown up hiking and camping, but this was different. Felt like the trees were watching me. That night, it came back. The same wailing sound, closer, and then footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. I sat up in my sleeping bag, gripping the rifle so hard my knuckles turned white. The lantern cast long shadows across the cabin walls. The footsteps moved along the porch, stopping just outside the door, then scratching. Fingernails? Claws? I held my breath. The scratching moved along the wood, slow and steady. I wanted to look out the window, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Then I heard my own voice, outside. It was faint, but I heard it. Someone or something was repeating my own words. Words I had spoken earlier that day, muttered to myself as I packed. The tone was wrong, the cadence off, like someone mimicking me without understanding what the words meant. I didn't move. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Eventually, the sounds faded. The footsteps retreated. The forest was silent again. The next morning, I found tracks outside the cabin. Not human, not animal, something in between. I needed to leave. I packed as fast as I could, hauled the boxes into the truck, double-checked the rifle. By noon, I was ready to go. But as I climbed into the driver's seat, something made me stop. A figure stood at the edge of the trees. Not an animal, not a person. Tall, thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The skin pale, almost gray. I blinked, and it was gone. I left, drove faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I didn't stop until I was hours away. I never went back. The cabin is still there, probably rotting away, forgotten by everyone except whatever still lingers in those woods. I don't know what my uncle saw. I don't know how long he lived with it, how long he listened to it moving outside his walls. I only know that I was lucky, because I left. I hadn't seen my cousin Daniel in years. Growing up, he had always been the tough one, the one who knew how to handle himself. We all thought he'd end up in the army, but instead he went into law enforcement, and from there into something more secretive. We all knew he worked for the government, but nobody knew exactly what he did. Special agent, some kind of investigator, whatever it was, he never talked about it. Then, one day, he retired early and moved out to a cabin in the middle of nowhere. I didn't think much about it until he invited me out there. He said he needed some help fixing the place up, and I figured it would be good to see him again. I had no idea what I was walking into. Daniel's cabin was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. The last stretch of road was barely more than a dirt path, winding through thick trees. By the time I arrived, the sun was already low, casting long shadows over the clearing where his cabin stood. It wasn't a big place, just a single-story log cabin with a tin roof, a small porch, and a shed off to the side. There was a truck parked outside, old but well-maintained. I got out of my car and stretched, feeling the stiffness from the long drive. Daniel stepped out onto the porch as I walked up. He looked older, leaner. His hair was shorter than I remembered, streaked with gray, and his face had the kind of lines that didn't come from age alone. He gave me a nod and gestured toward the cabin. Inside, the place was simple. A small living area, a wood stove, a table with a couple of chairs. A hallway led to the bedroom and a tiny bathroom. Everything was clean, but there was a feeling of weariness in the air. Something was off. I didn't ask. If Daniel wanted to tell me, he would. We spent the first couple of days working on the place. The roof needed patching, the porch needed reinforcing, and there was a lot of general upkeep. It was hard work, but it felt good. I liked the quiet, the way the air smelled out there. It was peaceful. But as the days passed, I started to notice things. Daniel was always watching the woods. Anytime we were outside, his eyes kept flicking toward the treeline. At first, I thought he was just cautious, years of training, maybe, but it was more than that. He was expecting something. One night, I woke up to the sound of him moving around. I got up and found him sitting by the window, a rifle across his lap, staring out into the dark. "What's going on?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He just kept watching the trees. Then, after a long pause, he said, "Just making sure." That was it. Just making sure. The next morning, I noticed something strange. Around the edges of the clearing, in the dirt, were footprints. They weren't ours. They were fresh. Someone had been walking around the cabin during the night. I told Daniel, but he just nodded, like he already knew. He didn't seem surprised. That was when I realized this wasn't new. This had been happening. Someone had been watching him for a long time. That night, I stayed up with him. We sat in the dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the wood stove. The rifle was on the table between us. Outside, the woods were silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. Then, sometime past midnight, we heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the edge of the trees. I felt my pulse hammer in my chest. Daniel didn't move. He just listened. The footsteps stopped. For a long time, there was nothing. Then, a quiet, scraping sound, like metal against wood. Daniel stood up, picked up the rifle, and motioned for me to stay put. He moved to the door, opened it just enough to look outside. Then he closed it again and locked it. He turned to me and said, "Go to bed." I didn't argue. I couldn't sleep, but I went to my room and shut the door. I listened to him moving around, checking the locks, making sure everything was secure. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Daniel was already outside, checking the perimeter. I joined him. There were more footprints now, circling the cabin, leading to the shed. The door to the shed was open. Inside, nothing looked disturbed, but Daniel was tense. He knelt down, studying the ground. Then he pointed to the dirt just inside the doorway. A single boot print, deeper than the others. Whoever it was, they had been standing there for a while. That day, Daniel was quiet. He didn't say much. He just worked, fixing things, checking the rifle, making sure everything was in place. That night, we stayed up again. The footsteps came back. This time, they came closer. The sound of something brushing against the cabin walls. The creak of wood on the porch. Daniel had the rifle in his hands, his jaw tight. Then silence. The longest, heaviest silence I had ever felt. Morning came, and whoever it was, they were gone again. But this time, they had left something behind. A single spent shell casing, right on the porch where we couldn't miss it. Daniel picked it up, turned it over in his fingers. Then he nodded, like something had been confirmed. He went inside, packed a bag, and told me we were leaving.
No explanation. No argument.
Just leaving. I didn't ask questions. We got in his truck and drove. We didn't stop until we were hours away. Only then, at some roadside diner, did he finally talk. "I worked a case a long time ago," he said. "Thought it was done. Guess not." That was all he said. But I understood. Someone from his past had found him. Someone who hadn't forgotten. We never went back to that cabin. Daniel sold the land, moved somewhere else. I don't know where. He didn't tell me. Maybe he didn't want me involved. Maybe he was trying to keep me safe. I never saw him again after that. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that cabin. The footprints in the dirt. the silence in the trees, and the feeling that, even now, someone is still out there watching, waiting. It was late October when I decided to take a break from city life and spend a few days in the countryside. Work had been stressful, and I just needed some time alone, away from everything. I found a small rental cabin on the edge of a woodland area in the Peak District. It wasn't too far from the nearest town, but it was isolated enough that I wouldn't hear traffic or deal with people. That was exactly what I wanted: peace, quiet, and space to clear my head. The cabin was basic but comfortable. It had a small kitchen, a wood-burning stove, and a single bedroom. The owner had left a few supplies, including firewood and bottled water, and assured me over email that the place was safe. There was no Wi-Fi and my phone signal was weak, but I had downloaded a few movies and brought some books, thinking I'd just relax for a few days, go on some hikes, and enjoy the solitude. The first day went exactly as planned. I arrived in the late afternoon, unpacked my things, and took a short walk around the area. The woods behind the cabin were thick and stretched for miles. The only sign of civilization was a narrow dirt road leading back to town, which was about a 30-minute drive away. As the sun set, I lit the stove, made some tea, and sat outside on the small porch, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. I went to bed early that night and slept deeply, only waking up once when I thought I heard something outside. Maybe an animal moving through the leaves. I didn't think much of it and went back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling well-rested. I made coffee and sat outside for a while, watching the mist rise from the trees. The air was crisp, and the quietness was refreshing. After breakfast, I decided to go for a longer hike, following a narrow path that wound deeper into the woods. It was sometime in the early afternoon when I first saw her. I was walking along the path when I noticed movement through the trees, maybe 50 meters away. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but something about it felt off. The figure was standing still, half hidden behind a tree. I squinted, trying to make out details. It was a woman. She was wearing dark clothing, and her posture was strange, rigid, like she was deliberately standing in a way that made it difficult to see her properly. I got the uneasy feeling that she had been watching me before I noticed her. I turned my head slightly, pretending not to see her, and kept walking. My instincts told me not to stare, not to acknowledge her, but I could feel her presence. After a few minutes, I glanced back. She was still there, standing in the exact same spot. I walked faster, trying to shake the uncomfortable feeling that crawled over me. Maybe it was just some local out for a walk. Maybe she was foraging or just enjoying the woods like I was. But something about her made my skin crawl. By the time I got back to the cabin, I had convinced myself that I was overreacting. I made some lunch, read a book, and tried to forget about it. As the afternoon stretched into the evening, I felt better. The cabin was warm and I was safe inside. Then, as I was washing up after dinner, I glanced out of the kitchen window. She was there, standing at the tree line, just beyond the clearing around the cabin. She wasn't moving. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the sink. My mind raced. How long had she been standing there? Had she followed me back? Why was she just standing there, not coming closer but not leaving either? The cabin suddenly felt much smaller. I stepped away from the window, keeping my breathing steady. I didn't want her to know I had seen her. I forced myself to move normally, pretending I hadn't noticed anything. I turned off the lights in the main room, leaving only the glow from the wood stove. I sat in the dark, listening. For a long time, there was nothing, just the wind outside. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard footsteps in the leaves. Slow, deliberate. I stayed completely still. The footsteps stopped. Then they started again, circling the cabin. I stayed awake for hours, listening to every tiny sound, every creak of the wood, every shift in the wind. I didn't move from my spot by the stove. I didn't even go near the windows. I just sat there waiting. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to sunlight streaming through the windows. My body was stiff, my mind foggy. For a brief moment, I felt relief. Maybe it had been my imagination. Maybe I had dreamed it. But when I stepped outside, I saw them. Footprints in the dirt, leading from the edge of the forest, circling the cabin, then disappearing back into the trees. They weren't mine. I wanted to leave. Every part of me screamed to pack my things, get in the car, and drive straight back to town. But I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a local had been passing through. Maybe I was being paranoid. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I spent the day close to the cabin, not going far, always checking the tree line. By evening, I was exhausted. I forced myself to eat, forced myself to act normal. And then, as the last light of the day faded, I saw her again. She was standing in the same spot as the night before. Only this time, she was closer. I felt my breath catch in my throat. She wasn't just standing there anymore. She was facing the cabin, directly at me. The way she stood was unnatural, stiff, her arms hanging limply at her sides. Her head was slightly tilted, her face obscured by shadows. I turned off the lights, but I knew she was still there. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't move. I sat in the dark, waiting for morning. Every noise outside sent my heart racing. I kept telling myself that as soon as the sun rose, I was leaving. I didn't care about the rental fee. I didn't care if I was overreacting. I just wanted to be gone. When dawn finally came, I grabbed my bag and threw everything into the car. I hesitated only once before getting in the driver's seat. I glanced toward the tree line. She was gone. I drove away without looking back. I never reported it. What would I even say? That a strange woman stood in the woods? That she didn't speak, didn't move, just watched? It wasn't illegal to be in the forest. But I knew something was wrong with her. I never went back to that area again. And sometimes, even now, I wonder, if I had stayed one more night, would she have come closer? I was up in the mountains for a week of hunting, something I had done every fall for years. I liked the solitude, the quiet of the woods, the way time slowed down when I was out there alone. The cabin I used was old but solid, built decades ago by a friend of my dad's, passed down to me when he moved to the city and gave up hunting. It wasn't much, just a one-room structure with a wood stove, a cot, and a few shelves. No electricity, no running water, but it kept the wind and snow out. It was late October, and the air had a sharp edge to it, the kind that told you winter wasn't far off. The leaves had mostly fallen, leaving the forest open, bare branches twisting against the gray sky. I had driven up a long dirt road that cut through miles of dense trees, parked my truck where the road ended, and hiked the last mile to the cabin. By the time I got there, the sun was already sinking, turning the sky the dull orange of late autumn evenings. I got a fire going in the stove, set up my gear, and ate a quick meal. The plan was simple: wake up before dawn, hike out to a ridge where I had spotted deer sign last year, and spend the day waiting. Nothing about this trip was supposed to be different from the ones before. That first night, I slept lightly, as I always did my first night out. The wind rattled the trees outside, and the fire in the stove crackled as it burned low. I woke up once or twice, listening to the silence, the deep quiet that you only get miles away from people. Morning came cold and still. I layered up, grabbed my rifle, and stepped outside. My boots crunched over frost-coated leaves as I made my way down the narrow trail leading away from the cabin. The forest felt empty, the way it always did in the early morning. I walked slow, quiet, taking my time. I reached the ridge just after sunrise, settled into position, and waited. Hours passed. I watched the trees, the valleys below, scanning for movement. By midday, I had seen nothing, not even birds. That was odd. Even on slow days, there were always birds flitting through the trees, squirrels rustling in the undergrowth. But the woods were dead silent, the kind of silence that put me on edge. By late afternoon, I gave up and headed back. I took a different route, moving through a thick patch of trees, hoping to flush something out. That's when I saw it. Tracks deep in the dirt, pressed hard like something heavy had moved through. But they weren't deer tracks. They were too large, too wide. At first, I thought they might belong to a bear, but the shape was wrong. Not round like a paw, but longer, almost human. I crouched down, studying them. They were fresh, maybe a few hours old at most. I followed them a little way before I realized they were heading toward the direction of my cabin. That wasn't right. No one was supposed to be up here. This land was private, miles from the nearest house or road. I felt a knot tighten in my gut. I wasn't scared yet, not really, just uneasy. I walked faster, keeping my rifle close, my eyes sweeping the trees. The closer I got to the cabin, the more aware I was of how quiet the woods had become. When I reached the clearing, I stopped. The cabin door was open. I knew I had shut it. I was sure of it. I moved slow, stepping carefully. I reached the doorway, peered inside. Nothing looked disturbed, but the air felt off, heavy, almost like the place wasn't mine anymore. I stepped inside, checked my gear. Everything was where I left it. My pack, my extra clothes, my food. I stood there for a long time, listening. Eventually, I convinced myself it was the wind. Maybe I hadn't latched the door right. Maybe the tracks were just from an animal I didn't recognize. I shut the door, locked it, and built up the fire. That night, I sat by the stove, rifle close. The wind picked up outside, moaning through the trees. I thought I heard something moving out there, just beyond the firelight. But when I stepped out onto the porch, there was nothing. I barely slept. By morning, I was exhausted but pushed through, heading out again, hoping the day would be different. It wasn't. The woods were still empty. No birds, no movement, just that heavy silence pressing in. I decided to head back early, a bad feeling creeping into my stomach. I was a few hundred yards from the cabin when I saw them. More tracks, deep, fresh, leading right to my cabin. My pulse hammered. I gripped my rifle, scanning the trees. Someone had been here. Again, I approached slow, listening. The door was shut this time. I stepped up onto the porch, pushed it open. Inside, everything looked the same, except for one thing. My pack was open. I hadn't left it that way. I checked my gear. Nothing was missing, but someone had been inside, going through my things. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Someone was watching me, messing with me. I wasn't alone out here. I locked the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and sat by the stove, rifle across my lap. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Every noise outside made my skin crawl. The wind, the creak of trees, the shifting of the cabin walls. Sometime past midnight, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I held my breath. The fire had burned low, casting shadows across the walls. I gripped my rifle tight, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped. I waited, straining to hear. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then a scrape, right against the cabin wall. I almost fired through the wood, but held back. I didn't know what I was dealing with. Minutes passed, then an hour. Eventually, the sounds stopped. Morning came slow. Gray light seeped through the windows. I forced myself to move, to get up. I opened the door, stepped outside. The ground was covered in fresh tracks. They led from the tree line around the cabin, then back into the woods. I packed my gear in minutes. No hesitation, no second thoughts. I wasn't staying another night. I hiked out fast, barely stopping. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror, back toward the trail leading to the cabin. For a second, I thought I saw movement, a figure half hidden in the trees. Watching, I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who was out there. Maybe some drifter, maybe a squatter. But whoever they were, they weren't just passing through. They had been watching me, waiting, and I wasn't gonna stick around to find out why. I never liked driving at night. The long, empty stretches of road, the occasional flicker of headlights from a passing car, the way the darkness seemed to press in on me. It always made me uneasy. But sometimes, life doesn't give you a choice. That night, I had to take the long drive through the mountains to check on a property my uncle had left behind. It wasn't anything special, just an old cabin in the woods, sitting on a few acres of land. He had used it for hunting trips when he was younger, but as the years went by, he stopped going. The place had been empty for years. My uncle had passed away 6 months ago, and now the cabin belonged to me. I hadn't planned on keeping it, but before I could sell it, I needed to see it for myself. The drive up the mountain was rough. The road was narrow, winding through thick trees, and the rain didn't help. It started as a light drizzle, but had turned into a steady downpour by the time I was halfway there. My truck's headlights barely cut through the sheets of rain. The tires slipped on the wet dirt road a few times, forcing me to slow down. When I finally saw the turnoff for the cabin, I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. I turned onto the narrow driveway, my tires crunching against the wet gravel. The cabin sat at the end of the road, just beyond a small clearing. It was an old structure, dark wooden walls, a pitched roof, and a front porch that sagged in places. The rain made it look even worse, the wood slick and black from the water. I parked the truck and grabbed my flashlight. The rain wasn't letting up, and I had to move quickly. I jogged up the steps and unlocked the door, pushing it open. The smell of dust and damp wood filled my nose. The air inside was thick and stale, like it had been sitting untouched for years. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The main room was small. Just a wooden table, a couple of chairs, and an old fireplace that hadn't been used in a long time. A narrow hallway led to a tiny kitchen and a single bedroom. The place was empty, just as I had expected. I checked the bedroom, making sure there were no animals inside. The bed was still there, covered in an old, stained mattress. The window on the far wall was shut tight, but the wind outside made the wooden frame creak. I went back to the main room and set down my bag. I had brought a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and some food, planning to stay the night before heading back in the morning. It was already too late to drive back in this weather, and I didn't want to risk the road in the dark. I sat down at the table, pulling out a sandwich from my bag. The wind howled outside, making the trees sway. Rain hammered against the windows, dripping from the edges of the roof. I tried to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. I wasn't afraid of the woods. I had been camping plenty of times, but something about being alone in that cabin didn't sit right with me. Halfway through my sandwich, I heard something outside. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rain. It was a sound, something moving in the trees. I froze, my hand gripping the edge of the table. The sound was faint, but I knew I had heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching against the wet ground. I stood up, my pulse hammering in my ears. I grabbed my flashlight and moved to the window, shining the beam outside. The rain made it hard to see, but I scanned the clearing. Trees.
Then,
Darkness. Nothing else. I turned back to the table, trying to convince myself it was just my nerves. The woods were full of animals. A deer, a raccoon, maybe even a bear. It didn't mean anything, but then I heard it again, closer this time. A soft, deliberate crunch of gravel. Someone was out there. I turned off the flashlight, my breathing shallow. The cabin had no locks on the windows, just old wooden latches. I moved quickly, checking each one, making sure they were secured. My heart pounded as I finished with the last window in the bedroom. And then I heard the porch creak. Someone had stepped onto it. I stood there, frozen, my body rigid. The sound was unmistakable. A slow, steady footstep on the wooden boards. Then another. I reached into my bag, my fingers wrapping around the handle of the hunting knife I had brought. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The footsteps stopped. The rain kept falling, tapping against the roof, dripping from the edges. I strained my ears, trying to hear past the storm. Nothing. Then the door handle rattled. I clenched my jaw, gripping the knife tighter. The handle twisted, but the door held. I had locked it when I came in. The old wood groaned as pressure was applied from the other side. Whoever was out there wasn't an animal. They were trying to get in. The door creaked, but it didn't give. My breath came in short, sharp bursts. I stepped back, my eyes locked on the handle. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The footsteps retreated, moving away from the porch, back into the rain. I didn't move. I stood there, knife in hand, waiting, listening. Minutes passed. The rain was the only sound. I didn't sleep that night. I sat against the far wall, the knife in my lap, waiting for the sun to rise. When morning came, I opened the door. The porch was wet from the rain, but there, on the wooden boards, were footprints.
bare footprints.
Whoever had been there had been walking barefoot. I didn't wait around. I grabbed my things and left, driving back down the mountain as fast as I could. I sold the cabin the following month. I didn't care about the money. I didn't care who bought it. I just wanted to be done with it. I never went back, and I never will. It was 2013, late October, and the rain had been falling since noon. It wasn't a gentle rain. It was the kind that soaked through your clothes in minutes, the kind that made everything smell of wet earth and old wood. I had been working as a forestry contractor for a few years, mostly doing surveys and checking for storm damage in remote areas. The job paid well, and I liked the isolation. This part of British Columbia was nothing but dense forests, winding trails, and the occasional logging road. The company had a few cabins scattered in different locations for overnight stays. Some were decent, others were barely better than a shed. The one I was heading to that night was one of the older ones, deep in the woods, about 15 miles from the nearest paved road. By the time I arrived, the sky was already dark. The rain had turned the dirt trail into a slick mess, and I had to take it slow. My truck's headlights cut through the sheets of rain, bouncing off the trunks of towering firs. The cabin was exactly where I remembered it, at the edge of a small clearing half hidden by trees. It was a simple one-room structure with a slanted roof and a covered porch. It had been built decades ago, used by woodsmen and surveyors before me. I killed the engine and listened to the rain hammering against the roof. The air smelled of wet pine and damp wood. I grabbed my bag, my flashlight, and the rifle I always carried when staying out this far. Black bears weren't uncommon, and I didn't want to take any chances. The door creaked open, and the inside was exactly how I left it last time. Bare walls, a small cot in the corner, a table with a couple of chairs, and an old cast-iron stove that had seen better days. I set my bag down and went straight for the firewood stacked near the door. The sooner I got a fire going, the sooner I could dry off. I struck a match, lit the kindling, and watched the flames take hold. The warmth spread slowly through the small space, pushing out the cold, damp air. I took off my wet jacket and boots, placing them near the stove to dry. Then I went to check the cabin itself. There was a back window, the kind that slid open but had no lock. I checked it, still closed. The front door had a simple latch, not much security, but enough to keep animals out. Everything seemed in order. I should have felt relieved, but something was bothering me. It was small things that didn't quite sit right. The firewood pile was shorter than I remembered. Not by much, but enough to notice. The cot's blanket was folded differently than how I'd left it last time. The chair at the table was slightly pulled out. Maybe someone else had used the place since I was last here. That wasn't uncommon. Other workers knew about these cabins. Still, it put me on edge. I shook it off, telling myself I was overthinking. I sat at the table and went through my bag, checking my supplies. I had enough food for 2 nights, canned stuff, some jerky, a thermos of coffee. I poured myself a cup and took a slow sip. The rain kept coming, heavier now, hammering against the roof. The wind picked up, making the trees creak outside. I sat there listening. There was something about nights like this, so far from everything, that made you feel small. I was about to turn in for the night when I heard something. At first, I thought it was just the rain, but then I heard it again. Something outside. A muffled thud, like footsteps in the mud. I froze, listening. Nothing. Then, another sound, closer this time. A soft scraping right outside the cabin wall. I grabbed my rifle and stood up. The fire cast flickering shadows across the walls, making the small space feel even smaller. I stepped carefully to the window and peered out, but all I could see was rain and darkness. Another noise, this time from the front porch. I took a slow breath, steadying myself, then moved to the door. The latch was still in place. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. Silence. I waited, but there was nothing. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon, maybe even a bear sniffing around. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. The sounds were deliberate, not the random movements of an animal. Someone was out there. I kept the rifle close as I backed away from the door. I didn't want to open it, not yet. Instead, I went to the back window, carefully lifting it just enough to hear outside. The rain poured, the wind blew, but then, faintly, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, careful, moving around the cabin. My stomach tightened. I moved to the stove, grabbed the fire poker, and crouched near the cot, keeping my back to the wall. If someone tried to get in, I'd be ready. The footsteps stopped. Minutes passed. Nothing. The only sound was the rain hammering the roof. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, but nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion won over, and I let myself sit down. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, gripping my rifle, listening. The night dragged on, the storm never letting up. But no more noises came. By morning, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. I opened the door cautiously, stepping onto the porch. The ground was slick with mud, and there, clear as day, were footprints. Not animal tracks.
Bootprints.
They circled the cabin, stopping at the back window, then the front door. Whoever had been out there had stood here for a long time, just listening. I scanned the trees, but the woods were empty. Whoever it was, they were gone. I packed my things quickly. I didn't care if I was scheduled to stay another night. I wasn't staying. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone step out of the trees. But the forest remained still. I never found out who it was, never got any answers. But I knew one thing for sure. Someone had been out there that night, and they weren't just passing through. I hadn't been back to the family cabin in almost 20 years. I never planned to either. It wasn't that I had bad memories there, at least not the kind that normally keep people away. My grandfather built that place in the late 1950s, long before I was born. It stood deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by thick trees and narrow dirt roads that twisted through the forest like veins. It was never meant to be a full-time home, just a hunting cabin. My dad and my uncle spent their childhoods there, learning how to track deer, set traps, and clean fish. When I was a kid, my dad brought me up there a few times. I hated it, not because of the isolation, but because of how strange the place felt. Something about it always made me uneasy. The last time I saw it, I was maybe 13. My dad stopped taking me after that. He always said he'd go back up there when he had time, but he never did. The cabin sat empty for years, rotting away, forgotten, until I inherited it. My dad passed away 3 months before I got the letter. It was a short, impersonal legal document, informing me that as his only son, the land was now mine. I almost threw it away. The last thing I wanted was to be responsible for that place. But something about it lingered in my head, gnawed at me in a way I couldn't shake. Maybe I felt guilty, like I owed it to my dad to at least check on it one last time. Maybe it was just curiosity. Either way, I made the drive up. It took almost 6 hours to get there. The last hour of the drive was slow, crawling along a barely maintained dirt road, dodging potholes and fallen branches. I almost missed the turnoff. The old wooden sign that used to mark the entrance was gone, probably rotted away. The path leading up to the cabin was overgrown, thick with weeds and tangled roots. I parked my truck as close as I could and walked the rest of the way. When I stepped into the clearing and saw it again, my stomach twisted. The cabin looked worse than I expected. The roof sagged in places. The wood was dark and swollen from years of rain and snow. Vines crawled up the walls, creeping through the cracks between the logs. The front steps were warped, some broken clean through. The whole place smelled like damp earth and mold. Still, I had come all this way. I wasn't about to turn around without at least looking inside. I pushed the door open. It groaned on its rusted hinges, the sound echoing through the empty space. Dust filled the air, thick enough that I could taste it. The inside looked exactly how I remembered, just older, more decayed. The stone fireplace sat cold and empty. The wooden table in the center of the room was still covered in old hunting gear, rusted knives, tangled fishing lines, empty bullet casings. The walls were lined with mounted deer heads, their glassy eyes covered in a thin layer of grime. I don't know what I expected to feel, standing there after all those years. Nostalgia? Regret? Instead, I just felt uneasy, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I told myself I was just being stupid. It was just an old, abandoned cabin. Nothing more. I spent the next few hours cleaning. I didn't know why. I had no plans to keep the place. Maybe it was just a way to distract myself. I swept up dead leaves and mouse droppings. I cleared out a family of squirrels that had nested in one of the cabinets. I checked the roof for leaks. As the sun started to set, I realized I had two choices. I could drive back to town and get a motel for the night, or I could stay. I should have left, but something about leaving in the dark didn't sit right with me. The nearest town was an hour away, and I didn't like the idea of trying to navigate that winding dirt road at night. Besides, the place still had a working wood stove. I had a sleeping bag in my truck. One night wouldn't hurt. I built a fire, ate a can of cold beans, and settled in. The first few hours were fine. The fire crackled, filling the room with dry heat. I sat in an old wooden chair, staring at the flames, trying to remember the last time my dad and I had been here together. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't some small animal rustling through the underbrush. It was slow, deliberate, heavy. I sat up, heart hammering. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. I listened, barely breathing. The footsteps moved along the porch. I reached for my flashlight, but my hands were shaking. The beam wobbled as I pointed it toward the door. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched out, long and suffocating. My ears strained, waiting for the sound to return. Nothing. After what felt like forever, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe it was just an old tree groaning in the wind. Maybe a deer had wandered too close. I told myself anything that made sense. I laid back down, forcing my body to relax. Then the footsteps started again. This time, they circled the cabin. I sat up so fast my head spun. My skin prickled, every instinct screaming at me to do something, to run, to hide, to fight. I grabbed the rifle I had brought with me, the same one my dad used to hunt deer when I was a kid. I checked the chamber. Loaded. I stood slowly, moving toward the window. The firelight cast a faint glow outside, but beyond that, everything was pitch black. I didn't see anything, but I knew, deep down, something was out there. For the next few hours, I sat in the chair, rifle in my lap, eyes fixed on the door. I didn't sleep. I barely blinked. At some point, the footsteps stopped. The night stretched on in heavy silence. When the first hint of sunlight crept through the trees, I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my things and left. I didn't clean up. I didn't put out the fire. I just threw everything into the truck and got the hell out of there. I don't know what I heard that night. I don't want to know. I sold the land as soon as I got back home. I didn't care how much money I lost. I just wanted to be done with it. I never went back, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I think about that cabin, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. I had been driving for hours when I first saw it. A small wooden cabin, just barely visible through the thick trees lining the dirt road. It was late afternoon, and the sun hung low in the sky, throwing long shadows across the ground. I wasn't supposed to be out here this long. I had been traveling through the countryside, heading to a small town where I had some business to take care of. I had taken a wrong turn a while back, and my phone had lost service about an hour ago. The road had started narrowing, turning from asphalt to gravel and then finally to packed dirt. It was clear that this was no longer a main road. I had considered turning around, but by then, I was too deep into the forest. My fuel gauge was running low, and I had no idea how far I was from the nearest town. I needed to stop, figure out where I was, and decide my next move. That was when I noticed the cabin. It sat alone in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pine trees. It was old, but not completely abandoned. The wood was dark and weathered, but the windows were intact, and there was no sign of collapse. A narrow driveway led from the main dirt road up to the front porch. I didn't see a car, but something about the place felt lived in. I pulled my car up slowly and cut the engine. For a few moments, I just sat there, listening. The forest was completely silent. Not even the sound of birds, just the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching on the gravel. The air smelled damp, like rain had passed through recently. The cabin had a front porch with a single wooden rocking chair. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn. There was no mailbox, no signs of anyone coming and going. I hesitated. Felt wrong to approach, but I was running out of options. Maybe someone inside could tell me where I was. Maybe they had a map. I stepped up onto the porch and knocked. My knuckles made a dull, hollow sound against the wood. I waited. Nothing. I knocked again, a little harder this time. Still nothing. I tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The cabin smelled like damp wood and old fabric. The furniture was covered in dust, but there were signs that someone had been here recently. A half-burned candle sat on the small wooden table in the center of the room. A stack of newspapers lay beside it, the top one dated just a few months ago. There was no electricity.
No lights.
The only illumination came from the fading sunlight filtering through the curtains. I stepped inside. The floor creaked under my weight. There were 2 rooms, the main living area and what looked like a small bedroom in the back. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, and there was a single old couch along the wall. It looked like no one had been here for a while, but not long enough for the place to be truly abandoned. Something about it made my skin crawl. I turned back toward the door, ready to leave, when I noticed something strange. The rocking chair outside was moving. The wind was barely blowing, just enough to rustle the leaves, but the chair rocked back and forth, slow and steady. I stepped back outside and looked around. The forest was still. The air was silent. I had the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I walked back to my car, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. I needed to get out of here. That was when I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, leading from the trees to the porch. Someone had been here. I spun around, my eyes scanning the trees. The sun was almost completely down now, and the shadows had stretched long across the ground. I listened, but all I could hear was my own breathing. I opened my car door, ready to get inside, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Something was standing just beyond the tree line. I froze. It was a man. He was standing perfectly still, partially hidden by the trees. I could barely make out his face, but I could see his eyes. They were locked onto me. I didn't move. For what felt like forever, we just stared at each other. He didn't step forward. He didn't run. He just stood there. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached into my car, fumbling for the keys. My fingers found them and I quickly got inside, locking the doors. When I looked back up, he was gone. The forest was empty. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered but didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. Panic started to creep in. I tried a 3rd time. The engine finally roared to life. I didn't waste a second. I threw the car into reverse, backing out of the driveway and onto the dirt road. My headlights cast long shadows through the trees, but there was no sign of the man. I pressed the gas and started down the road, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The road twisted and turned through the forest, the trees closing in around me. I drove as fast as I could, desperate to put distance between myself and that cabin. That was when I saw him again, standing in the middle of the road, far ahead, just barely illuminated by my headlights. I slammed the brakes. He didn't move. I threw the car into reverse, my tires kicking up dirt as I backed up. I turned the wheel, trying to find another way, but the road was too narrow. The trees were too thick. When I looked back, he was gone again. I didn't stop driving. I kept my foot on the gas, pushing forward, not looking back. The road eventually widened, and I saw the faint glow of distant lights. A town, civilization. I didn't slow down until I reached the main road. I pulled into the first gas station I found, my hands still shaking. I sat there for a long time, trying to catch my breath. I don't know who that man was. I don't know if he lived in that cabin or if he was just watching it. But I do know one thing. I wasn't supposed to be there, and neither was he. I didn't plan on being out there for so long. It started as a weekend trip, just a few days alone to clear my head. I had taken time off work, packed up some supplies, and driven out to my uncle's old hunting cabin in northern Montana. He hadn't used it in years, but it was still in decent shape the last time I checked. Just a small wooden place off an old logging road, surrounded by thick trees and too far from any town to hear traffic. It was the kind of place where you could sit outside at night and only hear the wind move through the trees. That was what I wanted: silence. No work, no stress, just a few days of chopping wood, fishing in the river a few miles down, and sitting by the fire at night. It was mid-September, the days still warm, but the nights cold enough to remind me that winter was on its way. I packed light, a sleeping bag, some canned food, a hunting rifle in case I felt like going after some deer. It was supposed to be simple. I got to the cabin late in the afternoon. The drive was rough, the dirt road full of potholes and overgrown with weeds. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it. Small, weathered, the wooden walls dark from years of rain. There was an old metal chimney on top, rusted but still solid, and a single window on each side, covered in dust and dead bugs. The front door had a heavy latch, but it wasn't locked. Inside, it smelled like old wood and damp air. There was a cot against one wall, a small wooden table in the middle, and a fireplace with a stack of dry logs beside it. A few old tools were still hanging on the walls, along with a faded map of the area. The place hadn't been used in years, but it felt safe enough. I spent the first evening settling in, sweeping out dust, stacking some firewood, and making sure the old oil lanterns still worked. By nightfall, I had a fire going in the fireplace and a can of beans heating up. I sat in the chair by the fire, listening to the wind outside and the occasional snap of the logs. It felt good to be out there. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound outside. It was faint, just a small rustling noise, like something moving through the leaves. I lay still, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was cold. I could hear the wind, but underneath it, something else. It wasn't an animal. Deer moved differently, and small animals like raccoons or foxes would make quicker, sharper sounds. This was slower, more deliberate. I sat up, pulling my sleeping bag off. My rifle was leaning against the wall near the cot, so I reached for it and held it close. I didn't move for a long time, just listened. The sound didn't come back. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing. Just the wind moving through the trees, maybe a branch falling somewhere. I lay back down but kept the rifle close. Morning came cold and gray. I stepped outside, stretching, my breath visible in the chilly air. The forest was quiet, the way it always was in the early morning. But something felt different. The ground around the cabin was covered in leaves and pine needles, undisturbed except for a few deer tracks near the edge of the clearing. But as I looked closer, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. A single boot print. It was near the back of the cabin, half covered by leaves, but it was there. Not my boot. Bigger, wider. The tread was deep enough to be recent, maybe sometime in the night. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. There was no reason for anyone else to be out there. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and the only road leading to the cabin was barely drivable. The land around it belonged to my family, miles of empty forest with no trails or campsites. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, checking for more prints. Nothing, just that one. It didn't make sense. If someone had been walking around in the night, there would be more tracks. I told myself it was old, that maybe it had been there for weeks and I just hadn't noticed. But I didn't believe that. I tried to ignore the feeling in my gut. The rest of the day went by normally. I walked down to the river, fished for a while, caught nothing, ate a cold lunch and sat by the water watching the trees. By evening, I was back at the cabin, stacking firewood and boiling some instant coffee over the fire. Night came fast. I locked the door, checked the rifle, and lay down on the cot. I didn't sleep. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Not just rustling this time. Footsteps. Slow, careful steps moving around the cabin. I gripped the rifle, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then started again, circling the cabin. My breath felt too loud in the silence. The footsteps stopped at the front door. I gripped the rifle tighter, waiting. My pulse hammered in my ears. Then, softly, something brushed against the door. A hand? I stayed completely still. No one knocked. No one tried to open it. Just that single touch, as if they were checking if I was inside. Then silence. I don't know how long I stayed like that, staring at the door. Minutes? An hour? My fingers were stiff around the rifle. I didn't hear anything else, but I knew someone had been there. Morning came slow, the light creeping in through the cracks in the window. When I finally opened the door, my stomach dropped. More footprints. Clear, deep prints in the dirt, circling the cabin. Whoever had been there had walked around it multiple times. And then, leading into the trees, a fresh set of tracks. I followed them a few feet into the woods before stopping myself. I didn't want to know where they led. I packed up immediately, threw my sleeping bag in the truck, tossed the rifle in the passenger seat, and left without a second thought. I didn't look back. The drive back to town was tense, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few minutes. When I got home, I locked my doors and sat in silence for a long time. I still don't know who was out there. A hunter? Someone passing through? Or were they watching me the whole time? I don't go back to that cabin anymore.